Hey guys, medieval Europe is often remembered for castles, crusades, and crowns, but the age was also shaped by something quieter and far more personal: the long memory of insult. In a world where courts were slow, borders were fragile, and reputation could be worth more than coin, revenge wasn't always a moment of fury. Sometimes it was a strategy stretched across years, even generations. And the most epic cases aren't the bloodiest ones. They're the ones where patience, law, and power turn payback into history. If you enjoy these slower, long-form deep dives, consider subscribing. A lot of regular listeners do, simply so they don't miss the next documentary-style story when it appears, and it helps more thoughtful history find its audience. Now, let's step into medieval revenge, not as sensational drama, but as a revealing window into how medieval societies actually worked. To understand revenge in the Middle Ages, it helps to begin with the medieval idea of justice. Much of Europe inherited a blend of Roman legal concepts, Christian moral teaching, and older Germanic customs where feuds could function as a kind of informal law. In many places, a wrong committed against you was not just personal. It was a wound to your household, your honor, and your standing in the community. Authorities often tried to limit vendettas through fines, arbitration, or formal settlements, but the machinery of the state was uneven, and local power mattered. That's where revenge becomes historically interesting. It's often the point where weak institutions meet strong emotions, and where people, especially elites, use the tools available to them. Sometimes those tools were armies. Sometimes they were marriages, lawsuits, church courts, and carefully timed accusations. One of the clearest medieval examples of revenge as politics comes from Italy, where city life created an unusually fertile environment for grudges to become public events. In the late Middle Ages, northern and central Italian cities were wealthy, crowded, and fiercely competitive. Families built power through trade, banking, and control of offices, and when rival clans fought, the conflict could spill into the streets and then echo in council chambers. Revenge here was not simply retaliation. It was a form of civic warfare, often disguised as the defense of order. A family might present its enemies as disturbers of the peace, push for exile through legal mechanisms, seize property during a political purge, and then fortify its dominance with alliances. This is one reason medieval Italian politics can seem so relentless. The law existed, but it could be weaponized. In that environment, revenge wasn't a secret. It was a public language of power, framed as righteousness, stability, or the common good, even when it was driven by private memory. If Italy shows revenge turning into civic structure, medieval Scotland offers a case where revenge became an event so notorious that later generations treated it like a warning label on politics. In 1440, in Edinburgh Castle, a pair of young noble brothers from the powerful Douglas family were invited to dine with the boy king, James II. The details are wrapped in later retellings, but the core is clear enough. The brothers were arrested and executed after the meal in what became remembered as the Black Dinner. It is often told as pure treachery, but what makes it a medieval revenge story is the deeper context. The Douglases had grown too powerful. Their rise threatened the crown and rival families. The invitation was not merely a trick. It was a statement about who controlled justice, who defined loyalty, and who got to decide when a family's influence became intolerable. The aftermath shows how revenge rarely ends cleanly. It triggered further resentment and conflict, contributing to years of instability. In medieval politics, revenge could solve one problem, remove a rival, while creating another that might be even harder to manage. A permanently offended network of kin and allies. For a different kind of revenge, one that moves from personal outrage to communal uprising, consider Sicily in 1282. By then, the island was ruled by Charles of Anjou, whose regime was widely resented. High taxes, foreign administration, and local humiliation created a pressure that had been building for years. The revolt known as the Sicilian Vespers erupted during Easter season, and it quickly spiraled into a wider political transformation as Sicily broke away and sought new rulers. It's easy to treat this as simply a rebellion, but contemporaries understood it in terms of redress and insult, the settling of accounts. The language of vengeance was not only emotional, it was political propaganda. Leaders and chroniclers framed violence and regime change as justified repayment for oppression. What makes it epic in historical terms is the scale of consequence. Revenge here didn't just punish individuals. It rearranged Mediterranean power, pulling in rival dynasties and foreign crowns. In the Middle Ages, the line between revenge and revolution could be thin, especially when a population felt that ordinary justice had been captured by outsiders. Not all medieval revenge stories are about sudden explosions. Some of the most revealing ones unfold like long legal arguments, where the goal is not a dramatic act but the slow stripping of an enemy's position. Medieval England offers many examples of this, because royal government and church courts created arenas where people could fight with documents and influence. A disgraced noble could return through carefully chosen loyalties, supporting a rival claimant, financing opposition, or aligning with a faction that promised restoration. A bishop could ruin a rival not through force, but by persuading Rome, shaping local verdicts, or using moral authority to isolate an opponent. In these worlds, revenge is sometimes quieter than we imagine, but no less decisive. Medieval people were often astonishingly skilled at waiting for the correct moment. When a king needed allies, when a rebellion weakened a rival, when a marriage made yesterday's enemy vulnerable. The result could look like justice to one side and vendetta to the other, with the same event described in completely different moral terms. To see revenge in its most dynastic form, where memory is inherited, look to the long tensions that shaped royal families. Medieval monarchies were not just families. They were institutions built on bloodline, legitimacy, and public trust. When a king punished a rival line, confiscated land, or questioned inheritance, the injury could echo for decades because heirs remembered what was taken from their house. This is one reason medieval civil wars could feel so inevitable. The conflict wasn't only about policies. It was about restoring what a family believed it deserved. And because medieval legitimacy mattered so deeply, revenge could be carried out through symbolism as much as action. Reclaiming a title, forcing a rival into submission, rewriting charters, public ceremonies that announced who was rightful. When we call these revenge stories, we're describing something medieval observers recognized. The past was never past. It lived in oaths, in family alliances, and in the careful recording of grievances. France in the later Middle Ages provides a vivid example of revenge as factional identity. In the early 1400s, French politics fractured between powerful groups, most famously the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, during a period of royal weakness and foreign pressure. Assassinations and retaliations occurred, But what matters for our purposes is how quickly revenge became a political program. Each side did not simply seek to hurt the other. It sought to define the other as criminal, illegitimate, and dangerous to the kingdom. Medieval politics often relied on moral framing, and revenge thrives in that environment because it can be presented as purification. Removing traitors, correcting wrongdoing, restoring true order. The tragedy, of course, is that revenge as a political identity is self-sustaining. Every act produces a new grievance, and each grievance becomes a reason for escalation. When we look at this period, we see how revenge can hollow out a state. Not because medieval people were uniquely cruel, but because institutions struggled to rise above faction when the highest offices were controlled by the factions themselves. Across these stories, city feuds, castle intrigues, island revolts, dynastic memories, factional wars, the medieval pattern becomes clearer. Revenge is rarely a single act. It is a process shaped by the available tools of a society. In places with strong courts, revenge could move through legal channels and the manipulation of reputation. In places where authority was contested, revenge might be delivered through sudden arrests, confiscations, or forced exile. In regions under foreign or unpopular rule, revenge could become communal and political, transforming into rebellion. And beneath it all sits the medieval reality that honor, family, and faith were not private matters. They were public currencies. A wrong left unanswered could look like weakness. A grievance resolved decisively could look like strength. The moral ambiguity is part of what makes these stories endure. The same action might be remembered as justice by one community and revenge by another. And that, in a way, is the most medieval twist of all. The Middle Ages didn't simply tolerate revenge. It argued about it, regulated it, preached against it, and repeatedly found ways to justify it. Even as Christian teaching emphasized forgiveness, medieval societies also built systems that recognized retaliation as a social force that had to be managed, not wished away. So when we study epic revenge stories from medieval history, we're not just collecting dramatic incidents. We're watching how power worked at ground level, how people responded when they felt law was insufficient, when honor was threatened, and when memory became a weapon. In the next stretch, we'll go deeper into additional case studies, the kind where revenge travels through alliances, diplomacy, and the slow turning of political gears, because medieval revenge is often less about rage and more about patience. One of the most famous medieval revenge arcs unfolded not in a city street or castle hall, but across decades of dynastic rivalry between England and France. The roots of what became known as the 100 Years' War were deeply legal claims of inheritance, feudal obligations, and disputed homage. But beneath those formal arguments lay something more personal. When the French crown passed away from the direct Cape Town line in 1328, Edward III of England believed he had a legitimate claim through his mother. The French nobility rejected it and selected Philip VI instead. From Edward's perspective, this was not simply a legal disagreement. It was a public denial of his status, a dismissal of his family's right. For years, Edward maneuvered cautiously. He performed homage for his French lands, negotiated, and built alliances. But gradually, as tensions mounted over territories in Gascony and Flanders, his position hardened. In 1337, he formally asserted his claim to the French throne. This was not an impulsive reaction. It was a calculated escalation. By proclaiming himself rightful king of France, Edward transformed what could have remained a border dispute into a dynastic confrontation of enormous scale. If there is revenge here, it is strategic rather than emotional. A king responding to perceived humiliation by attempting to overturn an entire political order. What followed were campaigns that reshaped Western Europe. English victories at Crécy and Poitiers were not merely battlefield successes. They were statements. They reinforced Edward's claim and publicly weakened the authority of the Valois monarchy. Yet the French response demonstrates how revenge can operate on both sides. Under Charles V, France avoided reckless confrontation, reorganized its military, and gradually reclaimed lost territory. Rather than seeking dramatic retribution, French leadership chose endurance. They allowed time, taxation, and institutional reform to accomplish what sudden fury could not. The war stretched across generations precisely because each side believed it was correcting an injustice inflicted by the other. If England and France show revenge operating between kingdoms, the Iberian Peninsula offers a striking example of revenge within a royal family itself. In 14th century Castile, King Peter I, often called Peter the Cruel by his enemies and Peter the Just by his supporters, faced rebellion from his half-brother Henry of Trastamara. The rivalry was rooted in legitimacy and favoritism. Peter relied heavily on certain advisors and was accused of sidelining powerful nobles, including his own relatives. Henry positioned himself as the defender of aristocratic rights and Castilian stability. What makes this story particularly medieval is how legitimacy and revenge intertwined. Henry did not simply oppose Peter. He framed his rebellion as redress for tyranny and injustice. With foreign support, including from France, Henry eventually confronted Peter in open conflict. In 1369, after a series of shifting alliances and campaigns, Peter was killed, and Henry took the throne as Henry II. Yet the act did not close the chapter. Peter's daughters and supporters did not forget. Through marriage alliances and diplomatic efforts, his bloodline continued to influence Iberian politics. Once again, revenge was not just an act of violence. It was a narrative. Each faction told the story differently, either as righteous correction or unlawful usurpation. In medieval society, where written chronicles shaped reputation for centuries, controlling that narrative was itself a form of revenge or vindication. Further north, in Scandinavia, medieval revenge often took on a more legalistic form, echoing older traditions of feud, but increasingly filtered through royal authority. Icelandic sagas, though written later, preserve memories of a culture where honor disputes could spiral into generations of conflict. By the High Middle Ages, Norwegian and Danish monarchs sought to curb these feuds by strengthening centralized law. Yet even with stronger kingship, elite families continued to maneuver against rivals, sometimes using accusations of treason or disloyalty to eliminate competitors. In Denmark during the 12th century, royal succession disputes repeatedly erupted into conflict between competing claimants backed by different noble factions. When one claimant gained the throne, he frequently punished rivals through exile, confiscation, or carefully staged trials. These measures were framed as lawful governance, but they carried the unmistakable imprint of revenge. Removing a rival family from power was not merely about security. It was about ensuring that a past challenge would not resurface. The medieval state, in these cases, functioned as both judge and instrument of retaliation. What unites these varied episodes, from Anglo-French rivalry to Castilian civil war and Scandinavian succession struggles, is the way revenge adapts to context. In societies with growing bureaucracies, revenge becomes administrative. In fractured regions, it becomes military. In urban republics, it becomes political exclusion. Yet always it is tied to reputation and legitimacy. Medieval rulers understood something modern audiences sometimes overlook. Power depended on perception. To leave an insult unanswered could encourage further defiance. To respond too harshly could alienate allies. The art of medieval revenge, if we can call it that, lay in balancing retribution with stability. A successful act of vengeance was one that restored authority without igniting uncontrollable backlash. Many failed to achieve that balance, and their stories serve as cautionary examples of how retaliation can spiral beyond its original intent. As we continue, we'll look even more closely at how individual monarchs and noble houses used exile, marriage, and long-term political strategy to settle scores that had once seemed personal, but ultimately reshaped entire kingdoms. If we move eastward into the Byzantine world, medieval revenge takes on yet another form, subtle, ceremonial, and often executed through blinding precision rather than open battle. The Byzantine Empire inherited Roman legal traditions and an elaborate court culture in which symbolism mattered deeply. Emperors ruled not only through force, but through ritual, titles, and the careful management of rivals within Constantinople's palace walls. In Byzantium, revenge was frequently inseparable from survival. When a new emperor seized power, often through a coup, he faced an immediate problem: what to do with the former ruler and his supporters. Execution was one option, but it carried risks. Killing a rival could create a martyr and provoke unrest. Instead, Byzantine emperors often chose mutilation, exile, or confinement in monasteries. These actions were presented as legal or even merciful alternatives, but they were unmistakably retaliatory. Blinding a rival, for example, rendered him ineligible to rule under prevailing norms that associated physical wholeness with divine favor. One of the clearest cases comes from the turbulent 11th century, when emperors rose and fell with unsettling frequency. After the deposition of Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes in 1071, he was captured by his rivals, formally deposed, and blinded. The act was justified by his opponents as necessary correction after military failure. Yet it also functioned as unmistakable revenge by the Doukas faction, who had long opposed him. The blinding ensured he could not reclaim authority, and it sent a message to others considering resistance. What makes Byzantine revenge particularly epic in historical terms is its theatrical quality. Punishment often unfolded in public settings, accompanied by formal declarations. It was not private rage but choreographed retribution. The empire's political culture recognized that vengeance, when framed as justice and performed within ceremonial bounds, could reinforce legitimacy. Still, such measures rarely ended factional rivalry. The Byzantine court remained a place where alliances shifted constantly, and today's avenger might become tomorrow's victim. Further west, in the Holy Roman Empire, revenge frequently emerged from conflicts between emperors and powerful regional princes. Because imperial authority was decentralized, rulers depended heavily on cooperation from dukes and bishops. When that cooperation failed, retaliation could be both personal and political. The 12th century struggle between Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa and the Lombard League in northern Italy demonstrates how imperial revenge could escalate into prolonged confrontation. Frederick sought to reassert imperial rights over wealthy Italian cities that valued autonomy. When those cities resisted, the emperor responded with military campaigns and punitive measures, including the destruction of Milan in 1162. The city's walls were torn down, and its population was dispersed. To Frederick and his supporters, this was the restoration of rightful authority. To the Lombard cities, it was imperial vengeance for their refusal to submit. The destruction of Milan did not settle the matter. Instead, it strengthened opposition, leading to further conflict and eventually to Frederick's defeat at the Battle of Legnano in 1176. Once again, revenge achieved short-term satisfaction but long-term resistance. Medieval revenge was rarely clean or final. It often created cycles that outlasted the original participants. The Holy Roman Empire's political structure, with its semi-autonomous princes, meant that punitive campaigns could not permanently extinguish regional identity or ambition. Retaliation sometimes reinforced the very solidarity it aimed to destroy. In England, a more personal yet equally consequential example can be found in the reign of King Edward II in the early 14th century. Edward's reliance on close favorites, such as Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, alienated much of the nobility. Powerful barons felt excluded and humiliated. When they rebelled, their actions were justified as defense of the realm against corrupt influence. After Gaveston was captured and executed by rebellious nobles in 1312, Edward never forgot the insult. Years later, when political fortunes shifted and he regained greater control, he moved decisively against his former opponents. Lands were confiscated, titles revoked, and leading rebels punished. The king's retaliation was methodical rather than impulsive. It sought not only punishment but deterrence. However, Edward's own eventual downfall illustrates the fragility of revenge as governance. His harsh measures deepened resentment, contributing to the rebellion led by Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer in 1326. Edward was deposed and power changed hands once again. The story demonstrates a consistent medieval pattern. Revenge may reassert authority temporarily, but if it fails to reconcile underlying grievances, it invites further upheaval. Across these diverse regions, Byzantium, the Holy Roman Empire, England, the structure of medieval revenge reflects the structure of medieval power. Where authority was centralized and ritualized, revenge became ceremonial and symbolic. Where authority was fragmented, revenge manifested through siege and suppression. Where monarchy depended on noble cooperation, revenge operated through confiscation and legal punishment. What binds these stories together is not spectacle, but calculation. Medieval leaders understood that retaliation had to serve a purpose beyond emotion. It had to reshape alliances, deter opposition, or restore legitimacy. When it succeeded, it stabilized rule. When it failed, it accelerated decline. In the next section, we'll examine how revenge also operated beyond kings and emperors, among noble houses, knightly orders, and even within the church, revealing that in medieval society, the pursuit of redress was not confined to thrones. Beyond kings and emperors, some of the most consequential revenge stories of the medieval world unfolded among powerful noble houses whose rivalries could rival those of monarchs. In societies where land, marriage alliances, and military followings determine status, an insult to one branch of a family could reverberate across an entire region. A clear example emerges in late medieval England during the Wars of the Roses. Although often remembered as a dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York, at its core the conflict was deeply personal. Richard, Duke of York, believed that his lineage gave him a stronger claim to the throne than the reigning Lancastrian king, Henry VI. When political instability and perceived mismanagement weakened Henry's authority, York's grievance transformed into open assertion. York's death at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460 did not end the dispute. Instead, it intensified it. His son, Edward IV, carried forward not only a political claim but also a personal vendetta. Victories at Towton and elsewhere were not simply steps toward kingship. They were framed as avenging a fallen father and correcting injustice. Yet when fortunes shifted again and Edward was briefly deposed in 1470, the cycle repeated. Restoration the following year came with renewed punishments and confiscations directed at Lancastrian supporters. What makes the Wars of the Roses such a defining medieval revenge story is the generational persistence of grievance. Sons avenged fathers. Brothers defended brothers. Alliances were sealed through marriage, only to fracture under suspicion. And even after Edward IV secured the throne, insecurity lingered. His brother Richard III would later seize power, citing doubts about legitimacy, an act that many contemporaries interpreted as betrayal. The ultimate victory of Henry Tudor at Bosworth in 1485 did not merely end a war. It symbolically closed decades of accumulated retaliation by uniting rival bloodlines through marriage. In this case, revenge concluded not through annihilation but through dynastic fusion. Revenge also shaped the history of knightly orders, particularly during moments of crisis. The suppression of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century remains one of the most dramatic episodes of medieval Europe. King Philip IV of France, heavily indebted to the order, moved suddenly in 1307 to arrest Templar leaders and accuse them of heresy and misconduct. The charges were severe, and the proceedings controversial. Historians continue to debate Philip's motivations, but financial strain and political calculation clearly played roles. Whether driven by fiscal need, suspicion, or resentment toward an autonomous and wealthy institution, Philip's actions functioned as a decisive strike against a powerful body beyond his direct control. The arrest of Grand Master Jacques de Molay and the eventual dissolution of the order reshaped the landscape of European finance and crusading institutions. For contemporaries, the event carried the tone of retribution. Philip framed the arrests as moral cleansing, a defense of faith and order. Critics viewed it as calculated revenge against a creditor. As in many medieval revenge narratives, the justification depended on perspective. What is undeniable is the lasting impact. An order that had operated across Christendom for nearly 2 centuries vanished within a few years, its properties redistributed and its legacy contested. Even within the Church itself, revenge could operate beneath the language of theology and reform. The conflict between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip IV illustrates how ecclesiastical and royal authority collided at the highest levels. Boniface asserted papal supremacy over secular rulers, issuing declarations that challenged Philip's taxation of clergy. Philip responded with accusations, propaganda, and eventually the dramatic seizure of the Pope at Anagni in 1303. Although Boniface was released shortly afterward, he died soon after, and the papacy soon relocated to Avignon under French influence. To some observers, Philip's actions were revenge for papal interference. To others, they were necessary defense of royal sovereignty. The episode underscores how revenge in the medieval context could reshape institutions far beyond the individuals involved. The so-called Babylonian captivity of the papacy altered church politics for decades, demonstrating how retaliatory measures could carry unintended structural consequences. Across noble houses, knightly orders, and even the papal court, medieval revenge followed recognizable patterns. It often emerged where authority overlapped and boundaries were unclear. It relied on framing, presenting retaliation as justice, reform, or protection of the common good. And it frequently produced results that extended far beyond the initial grievance. Perhaps the most striking lesson is that revenge in the medieval world was rarely impulsive. It was strategic, often patient, and deeply embedded in systems of honor and legitimacy. Individuals acted not only for themselves but for their lineage, their faction, or their interpretation of rightful order. The stakes were rarely small. Land could be lost, titles erased, institutions dismantled. And yet, for all its drama, medieval revenge also reveals a society striving, however imperfectly, to balance power. The repeated cycles of retaliation eventually encouraged stronger legal frameworks, clearer succession rules, and more centralized authority in many regions. In that sense, revenge helped shape the evolution of governance itself. As we move toward closing this exploration, it becomes clear that the most epic revenge stories of medieval history are not defined by spectacle alone. They are defined by consequence, by the way personal grievance could alter kingdoms, redirect faith, and redraw the political map of Europe. As we draw these threads together, it becomes clear that medieval revenge was never merely about emotion. It was about structure. The Middle Ages were defined by layered loyalties: family, lord, king, faith. And when one layer failed to protect an individual or a group, retaliation often moved through another. What appears to modern audiences as dramatic vengeance was, in many cases, a calculated effort to restore balance in a world where formal justice was inconsistent and authority frequently contested. One final dimension worth examining is how memory preserved and amplified revenge long after the original actors were gone. Medieval chroniclers did not write neutral accounts. They recorded events through moral lenses shaped by patronage and loyalty. A king's suppression of a rival might be described as righteous correction in one chronicle and cruel vengeance in another. Over time, these narratives hardened into reputations. The cruel, the just, the bold. Such labels were not casual. They were part of how societies remembered retaliation. Consider again the dynastic struggles of England and France. By the time later generations looked back on the 100 Years' War, individual grievances had merged into national memory. The war was no longer only about Edward III's claim or Philip VI's refusal. It became a story of endurance, identity, and rivalry between kingdoms. The original insult was almost secondary to what it produced. A century of intermittent conflict that shaped language, taxation, military organization, and even concepts of sovereignty. Revenge, in this case, outgrew its starting point and became embedded in national history. The same can be said of the Wars of the Roses. What began as contested succession evolved into a cultural memory of instability and ambition. Later Tudor rulers carefully curated that memory, portraying their own rise as the necessary conclusion to decades of destructive retaliation. By controlling how revenge was remembered, they strengthened their legitimacy. Medieval revenge did not end with victory. It continued in storytelling. Another important theme is restraint. While many episodes escalated into open conflict, medieval societies also developed mechanisms specifically designed to prevent endless cycles of retaliation. Marriage alliances were among the most powerful tools. By uniting rival houses, elites transformed enemies into kin. The marriage of Henry VII to Elizabeth of York is the clearest English example, symbolically merging Lancaster and York after prolonged warfare. In other regions, similar unions brought temporary peace to feuding families. Church mediation also played a role. Bishops and abbots frequently acted as arbiters in disputes between nobles. Public penance, compensation payments, and negotiated settlements offered alternatives to prolonged vendetta. These measures reveal that medieval people were fully aware of revenge's dangers. They did not romanticize endless retaliation. They feared its capacity to destabilize entire regions. Even royal pardons functioned as instruments of controlled closure. A king who forgave a rebel could transform a former enemy into a loyal subject, provided the gesture was timed correctly. Such pardons were not always acts of mercy alone. They were political calculations. By ending a cycle deliberately, rulers demonstrated confidence and reinforced hierarchy. The power to forgive was as meaningful as the power to punish. In many ways, the medieval world was a laboratory of political psychology. Leaders learned that revenge had to be measured. Excessive retaliation risked rebellion. Insufficient response invited contempt. The most successful rulers understood that restoring authority required a balance between firmness and reconciliation. Those who misjudged that balance often lost their thrones. When modern audiences encounter epic revenge stories from medieval history, there is a temptation to focus on dramatic episodes. A banquet turned deadly, a city destroyed, a rival blinded. But the deeper story lies in the systems surrounding those moments. Revenge was rarely chaotic. It was shaped by law codes, inheritance customs, feudal obligations, and religious doctrine. It unfolded within a society that placed extraordinary weight on honor and continuity. And perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate. Medieval revenge was not abstract. It was tied to family names, inherited lands, sacred authority, and public ceremony. It unfolded slowly, often across decades, and its consequences were visible in borders, institutions, and dynasties. In the end, the most epic revenge stories of medieval history are not simply tales of retaliation. They are case studies in power, how it is challenged, defended, and remembered. They reveal a world striving to impose order on human emotion, sometimes succeeding, often failing, but always leaving a record that allows us to trace the intricate relationship between grievance and governance. And when we look closely, we see that medieval revenge was rarely the end of a story. More often, it was the turning point that shaped everything that followed. There is one more layer to medieval revenge that deserves attention, and that is the way it intersected with the concept of divine justice. Medieval Europe was profoundly religious. Political authority was understood, at least in theory, as flowing from God. Kings were anointed. Oaths were sworn on sacred objects. Wars were justified with reference to moral order. In such a worldview, revenge was never purely personal. It had to be framed within a larger moral universe. When rulers punished rivals, they often described their actions not as vengeance, but as the correction of sin or the defense of rightful order. A rebellious noble was not merely an opponent. He was a disturber of God's peace. A rival claimant was not just inconvenient. He threatened divinely sanctioned hierarchy. By placing retaliation inside a religious narrative, medieval leaders transformed potentially destabilizing acts into moral necessities. Yet this strategy carried risk. If events turned against a ruler, the same religious framework could be used to interpret his downfall as divine punishment. Chroniclers regularly described the deaths or defeats of controversial kings as evidence of heavenly judgment. In that sense, medieval revenge could appear to be answered by a higher revenge. The fall of a ruler who had ruled harshly was sometimes portrayed as the ultimate balancing of accounts. This belief in providence also influenced ordinary people. Local feuds were sometimes paused or resolved during religious seasons. Pilgrimages could serve as acts of penance after violent conflict. The Church consistently preached forgiveness, even while acknowledging that secular authorities had the right to punish wrongdoing. The tension between mercy and retribution was not ignored. It was debated openly in sermons, letters, and legal treatises. Another dimension of medieval revenge lies in exile. Banishment was a powerful alternative to execution, especially among elites. Removing a rival from his homeland stripped him of immediate influence without necessarily ending his ambitions. But exile rarely erased resentment. Dispossessed nobles often sought foreign allies, gathering support and waiting for an opportunity to return. The history of medieval Europe contains numerous examples of exiled claimants who came back with renewed strength. Their return was frequently framed as vindication, even destiny. What began as punishment became the seed of future retaliation. In this way, exile extended revenge across borders, internationalizing what might otherwise have remained a domestic dispute. We also see revenge expressed economically. Confiscation of lands, redistribution of estates, and manipulation of inheritance law were common tools. Property was power in the medieval world. To seize an enemy's lands was to weaken his lineage for generations. Such actions were often justified legally, but they carried unmistakable retaliatory intent. Over time, patterns of confiscation and restoration contributed to shifting maps of aristocratic dominance. It is worth noting that medieval revenge was not confined to Christian Europe. Similar patterns appear in other medieval societies, where honor, legitimacy, and dynastic memory shaped political life. While cultural frameworks differed, the core dynamics, grievance, retaliation, and the struggle to balance justice with stability were strikingly consistent. This suggests that revenge as a historical force is less about a particular civilization and more about how pre-modern societies managed authority without fully centralized states. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, stronger bureaucracies and standing armies gradually reduced the space for private vendetta among elites. Monarchs increasingly monopolized violence. Legal systems expanded. Yet the legacy of medieval revenge did not disappear. It lingered in literature, in national myths, and in the reputations of rulers whose actions were remembered for centuries. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from these epic revenge stories is that retaliation, when institutionalized, becomes part of governance. Medieval societies learned, often painfully, that unchecked cycles of revenge could fracture kingdoms. They also learned that controlled retaliation, framed as lawful and measured, could reinforce authority. The tension between these outcomes shaped political evolution across Europe. So when we step back and consider medieval revenge as a whole, we see more than dramatic episodes. We see a pattern of cause and effect. An insult challenges legitimacy. Retaliation seeks restoration. The method chosen, battle, exile, confiscation, alliance, reflects the structure of power at that moment. And the outcome reshapes the political landscape in ways that often outlast the original grievance. In that sense, the most epic revenge stories of medieval history are not about anger alone. They are about transformation. They mark the moments when private memory collided with public authority, and in doing so altered the course of kingdoms. As we reach the final stretch of this exploration, it's worth slowing down and asking a broader question. Why does medieval revenge feel so enduring, so structurally important, compared to similar stories in later centuries? The answer lies partly in the nature of medieval governance itself. Authority during the Middle Ages was deeply personal. Kings ruled through relationships. Lords commanded loyalty through land grants and protection. Justice was often administered face to face. When those relationships fractured, the consequences were immediate and intimate. In a world without modern bureaucratic distance, an insult was rarely abstract. It had a face, a lineage, and a network of allies. To challenge someone publicly was to challenge their honor, and honor was inseparable from political survival. This is why so many medieval revenge stories escalate beyond what might seem proportionate. A slight against a noble was not merely embarrassing. It threatened credibility, and credibility was the foundation of power. We can see this dynamic clearly in the repeated pattern of deposition and restoration that marked medieval monarchies. When a king was overthrown, whether in England, Byzantium, or elsewhere, the act did not simply remove a ruler. It destabilized the principle of continuity. Supporters of the deposed monarch often felt morally obligated to respond. If they succeeded in restoring their candidate, the restoration itself became framed as justice served. If they failed, their resistance could still shape future politics through memory and martyrdom. Even architectural choices reflected this culture of remembered grievance. Castles were not only defensive structures, they were symbols of authority built in stone. When a rival stronghold was dismantled after rebellion, it sent a message that echoed physically across the landscape. The absence of walls, the confiscation of land, the redistribution of estates, these were visible reminders that retaliation had occurred. Medieval revenge left marks not only in chronicles but in geography. Literature of the period further reinforces how normalized the concept was. Chivalric romances often revolved around quests to avenge a wronged family member or restore lost honor. While these stories were stylized, they reflected real social expectations. Loyalty demanded response. Inaction risked shame. Yet even within literature, the tension between vengeance and mercy is constant. Heroes are praised not simply for striking back, but for doing so in ways that reaffirm moral order. Over time, this tension encouraged gradual change. As monarchies strengthened in the later Middle Ages, rulers increasingly positioned themselves as the sole arbiters of justice. Private feuds were discouraged or outlawed. Royal courts expanded their jurisdiction. By absorbing the right to punish into centralized institutions, emerging states reduced the space for personal vendetta among elites. This was not an immediate transformation, but a gradual one, built partly on centuries of observing how destructive unchecked retaliation could be. And yet, even as formal structures strengthened, the emotional logic of revenge did not vanish. It evolved. Diplomatic rivalries between kingdoms continued to carry echoes of earlier dynastic insults. Propaganda framed wars as necessary corrections of past betrayals. The language shifted, but the underlying human impulse to respond to perceived injustice remained present. Looking back across the medieval period, what stands out most is not the violence of these revenge stories, but their complexity. Rarely were they simple tales of cruelty. More often, they were entangled with legal claims, religious justifications, economic interests, and deeply rooted ideas about legitimacy. Revenge operated within systems. It was shaped by them and in turn reshaped them. For modern audiences in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia, societies built on inherited legal traditions from medieval Europe, these stories are not entirely distant. The concepts of due process, sovereign authority, and institutional justice developed partly in response to centuries of conflict where personal retaliation once filled the gaps. Understanding medieval revenge helps explain why later generations placed such emphasis on impartial courts and centralized law. So when we consider the most epic revenge stories in medieval history, we're not just recounting dramatic episodes of betrayal or triumph. We are tracing the evolution of governance. We are observing how societies learned, slowly and imperfectly, to channel human grievance into structured systems rather than endless cycles of retaliation. And perhaps that is the quiet conclusion of this journey. Medieval revenge was powerful because it exposed the fragility of authority. It revealed how easily order could fracture when legitimacy was questioned. But it also revealed something else, that out of these cycles of grievance and response, stronger institutions gradually emerged. In the end, revenge in the Middle Ages was never only about settling scores. It was about defining who had the right to rule, who could enforce justice, and how memory itself could shape the destiny of nations. Before we close completely, it's worth reflecting on one final pattern that appears again and again in medieval revenge stories: the role of time. In the modern imagination, revenge is often immediate, a swift answer to a sudden wrong. In the medieval world, however, time itself was one of the most powerful weapons available. Patience allowed grievances to mature into opportunity. A dispossessed heir might spend years at a foreign court, building alliances. A sidelined noble might wait for a monarch's death before pressing an old claim. A humiliated faction might outwardly submit while quietly strengthening its position through marriage, wealth, and influence. In many of the cases we've explored, whether in England's dynastic wars, Castile's internal struggles, or Byzantine court politics, the decisive moment often came long after the original insult. This long memory was sustained by family structure. Medieval elites did not think in short political cycles. They thought in generations. Land passed from parent to child. Titles were inherited. Claims could lie dormant for decades before resurfacing. When a grievance was recorded in a charter or chronicled in a monastery, it did not disappear with the death of the individual who first felt wronged. It became part of the family's historical identity. In this sense, revenge in the Middle Ages functioned almost like inheritance. Just as estates were transmitted through bloodlines, so too were unfinished disputes. A son might view the recovery of confiscated land not as aggression, but as fulfillment of duty. The moral framing mattered. To later generations, avenging an ancestor could be interpreted as restoring rightful balance rather than perpetuating conflict. At the same time, medieval societies developed rituals that marked the formal ending of revenge. Public ceremonies of reconciliation, shared feasts, witnessed oaths, symbolic gestures of submission were crucial. These were not theatrical excesses. They were mechanisms for drawing a visible line under hostility. Without such rituals, uncertainty lingered. With them, peace gained social recognition. Consider how often peace treaties in medieval Europe included marriages, exchanges of hostages, or solemn religious ceremonies. These were not merely diplomatic customs. They were acknowledgments that revenge could only truly end when both sides accepted closure publicly. Private forgiveness was not enough. Legitimacy required visibility. There is also an important psychological dimension. In a world where mortality was high and political life unstable, medieval rulers understood the danger of leaving behind unresolved enemies. A harsh punishment might remove a rival, but it could also create a legacy of bitterness among that rival's kin. Measured reconciliation, though sometimes risky, could neutralize future threats. The balance between intimidation and integration was delicate. We can see this most clearly in transitions of power. New dynasties often faced a choice: eliminate all potential challengers, or incorporate former opponents into the new order. Total elimination risked rebellion from those who feared they might be next. Inclusion required trust. The most durable settlements tended to combine firmness with strategic mercy. As the medieval period moved toward the early modern era, the consolidation of state power gradually narrowed the space for aristocratic revenge. Standing armies reduced dependence on feudal levies. Permanent courts expanded legal oversight. Written bureaucratic records replaced many informal agreements. These developments did not eliminate conflict, but they changed its expression. Personal vendetta gave way to institutional prosecution. And yet, when we look back at medieval revenge stories today, what draws us in is not simply their drama. It is their clarity. The stakes were visible. The actors were known. The consequences unfolded in ways that directly reshaped political order. In a time before mass media or complex bureaucracies, power struggles were intensely human. The epic quality of these stories lies not in spectacle alone, but in scale and consequence. A banquet in a Scottish castle altered noble alliances. A disputed inheritance claim ignited a century-long war. The arrest of a military order reshaped European finance. A deposition in Constantinople redirected imperial policy. Each began with grievance, but each extended far beyond personal emotion. In the end, medieval revenge reveals something fundamental about the era itself. It shows us a world where authority was constantly negotiated, where honor and legitimacy were inseparable from governance, and where memory could be as powerful as an army. These stories endure because they illuminate the fragile foundations of power and the human instincts that both threaten and reinforce it. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson beneath all the drama. Medieval revenge was never simply about retaliation. It was about restoring order as people understood it, defending identity as they defined it, and shaping a future that felt secure in a world that rarely was. As a final reflection, it's important to step back from the individual episodes and consider what medieval revenge ultimately tells us about the nature of historical change. When we examine these stories closely, we begin to see that revenge often functioned as a stress test for political systems. It exposed weaknesses. It revealed where authority lacked clarity. And in many cases, it forced societies to adapt. Take the recurring pattern of disputed succession. Again and again across medieval Europe, the absence of a clear heir, or the presence of competing claims, sparked retaliation that escalated into war. These crises were not just personal disputes. They were constitutional problems in a world without written constitutions. Over time, kingdoms responded by refining inheritance rules, strengthening coronation rituals, and codifying lines of succession. In other words, repeated cycles of revenge encouraged structural reform. Similarly, conflicts between monarchs and nobles gradually reshaped the balance of power. When kings overreached and retaliated too aggressively, they risked collective rebellion. When nobles pursued vendetta without restraint, they weakened the realm. The tension between these forces pushed many medieval states toward clearer legal frameworks. Charters such as England's Magna Carta, though born from conflict, illustrate how grievance could be transformed into negotiated limitation of power. Revenge created crisis. Crisis demanded structure. We can also see how medieval revenge shaped concepts of legitimacy. Rulers learned that force alone was insufficient. To ensure stability, retaliation had to appear lawful and morally justified. Chronicles, sermons, and public declarations became tools in this process. By presenting punitive action as defense of order, leaders sought to convert vengeance into justice in the eyes of their subjects. This emphasis on perception laid groundwork for later developments in statecraft, where legitimacy became as important as military strength. Another long-term consequence was the gradual separation of personal and institutional authority. In the early Middle Ages, a king's household and the machinery of governance were closely intertwined. Over centuries, however, offices became more defined, bureaucracies expanded, and legal procedures formalized. As institutions strengthened, the space for purely personal retaliation narrowed. Disputes increasingly moved from battlefield to courtroom. Yet even as structures evolved, the cultural memory of medieval revenge endured. Later generations looked back on these episodes as moral lessons. Chroniclers emphasized the dangers of pride, the instability of unchecked ambition, and the tragic costs of factionalism. These narratives shaped political thought in the Renaissance and beyond. The idea that civil discord could destroy kingdoms became a recurring warning in European literature and political theory. For modern viewers, particularly in countries whose legal and political traditions trace roots to medieval Europe, these stories offer context for the institutions often taken for granted today. Independent courts, codified succession laws, and centralized authority did not emerge in a vacuum. They developed partly in response to centuries where personal grievance could destabilize entire realms. It's also worth acknowledging the human dimension beneath the structural analysis. Medieval revenge stories endure because they are deeply personal. They involve betrayal, loyalty, ambition, and fear, emotions that remain recognizable across centuries. What differs is the scale of consequence. In the Middle Ages, personal conflict among elites could redirect the fate of nations with remarkable speed. When we hear about a banquet that ended in execution, a rival blinded in a palace, or a dynasty toppled after decades of tension, we are witnessing more than isolated drama. We are observing the fragile architecture of power under strain. Revenge in these contexts was not an anomaly. It was a mechanism through which authority was contested and redefined. And so, the most epic revenge stories in medieval history are epic not because they are sensational, but because they are transformative. They altered borders. They reshaped institutions. They influenced how future generations understood justice and authority. They remind us that governance is never static. It evolves through conflict as much as through consensus. In closing, medieval revenge stands as both caution and catalyst. It warns of the destructive potential of unchecked grievance, yet it also highlights how societies learn from instability. Out of cycles of retaliation emerged stronger states, clearer laws, and more defined concepts of legitimacy. What began as personal injury often became political turning point. And in tracing those turning points, we gain a clearer understanding of how the medieval world moved, slowly, unevenly, but decisively, toward the foundations of the modern age. And perhaps the most important realization, when looking across all of these medieval revenge stories, is that they reveal a world in transition. The Middle Ages are often described as an era of instability, but instability is not the same as chaos. It was a period in which systems of power were still forming, where older traditions of kin-based loyalty and feud coexisted with emerging ideas of centralized justice. Revenge, in that environment, acted almost like a bridge between two political realities. On one side stood the older logic. Honor must be defended. Insult must be answered. Lineage must be protected. On the other side stood a growing institutional framework. Royal courts, codified law, diplomatic treaties, and written records. Medieval revenge stories sit precisely at the point where those two worlds collided. When a noble sought vengeance through private war, he was operating within an older tradition of feud. When a king punished that same noble through confiscation ratified by council and church, he was asserting a newer model of authority. Each clash between them was not only personal, it was constitutional in effect. Over time, the balance shifted steadily toward institutional control, but the path there was shaped by centuries of retaliation and counter-retaliation. There is also a geographical dimension to consider. Regions with stronger urban institutions, such as parts of Italy or the Low Countries, often saw revenge expressed through political exclusion, exile, or economic pressure. In more rural or frontier regions, it more readily took military form. This variation reminds us that medieval Europe was never uniform. The structure of revenge reflected the structure of society in each place. Even language evolved alongside these developments. Early medieval sources speak openly of vengeance and feud as accepted responses to wrongdoing. Later texts increasingly emphasize justice, legality, and order. The shift in vocabulary mirrors a deeper cultural change. It does not mean revenge disappeared, but it was reframed. Rulers no longer boasted of vengeance. They justified enforcement. At the same time, memory continued to shape identity. Royal houses traced their legitimacy through carefully preserved genealogies. Chroniclers recorded betrayals and triumphs with deliberate emphasis. These records were not neutral archives. They were tools. By shaping how the past was remembered, medieval elites influenced how future conflicts would be interpreted. This long continuity of memory explains why some medieval revenge stories resonate even today. They became foundational myths. The struggle between Lancaster and York, the rivalry between English and French crowns, the dramatic fall of powerful orders or emperors. These episodes were retold for centuries, shaping literature, national identity, and political symbolism. Yet beyond the myth, there remains a sober historical truth. Revenge was rarely clean. It rarely resolved conflict permanently. It often achieved immediate goals at the cost of long-term instability. And it repeatedly forced societies to confront the limits of personal authority. If there is a single thread connecting the most epic revenge stories of medieval history, it is this. Each one marks a turning point where private grievance collided with public power. Sometimes the result was consolidation and reform. Sometimes it was fragmentation and decline. But in every case, the consequences extended far beyond the original insult. For modern audiences, these stories offer perspective. They remind us that political systems are fragile when legitimacy is unclear. They show how personal ambition can reshape institutions. And they demonstrate that justice, to be sustainable, must be perceived as fair rather than retaliatory. In the quiet distance of centuries, medieval revenge no longer feels immediate. The castles stand in ruin. The battlefields are fields again. But the patterns remain visible in the historical record. They reveal an age wrestling with authority, struggling to contain human emotion within evolving structures of law and governance. And in that struggle, we find the true epic scale, not just in dramatic moments of retaliation, but in the gradual transformation of medieval society itself. If we allow ourselves one final lens through which to view these stories, it is this: medieval revenge was as much about fear as it was about anger. Beneath every act of retaliation lay a deeper anxiety, the fear of appearing weak, the fear of losing legitimacy, the fear that a single unanswered challenge might invite many more. In societies where communication was slow and authority depended heavily on reputation, perception could determine survival. A medieval ruler who failed to respond to open defiance risked more than embarrassment. Nobles might interpret restraint as incapacity. Rivals might test boundaries. Allies might reconsider their loyalty. In that environment, retaliation became a signal. It announced that authority remained intact. Yet, as we have seen repeatedly, the signal had to be calibrated. Too harsh a response created martyrs and united opposition. Too soft a response encouraged further challenge. This delicate balance is visible in the careers of numerous medieval monarchs. Some, like Edward I of England, cultivated a reputation for firmness combined with administrative reform, reinforcing royal authority through both force and law. Others misjudged the atmosphere around them and faced deposition or rebellion. The difference often lay not in the presence or absence of revenge, but in how it was framed and limited. It is also worth considering how ordinary people experienced these cycles of elite retaliation. While chronicles focus on kings and nobles, the consequences filtered downward. Prolonged dynastic conflict disrupted trade, agriculture, and local stability. Cities caught between rival factions suffered economically. Peasants bore taxation burdens imposed to fund wars rooted in disputed honor or succession. In this way, medieval revenge was never confined to castle walls. Its ripple effects touched entire societies. And yet, paradoxically, those same societies developed resilience. Local communities learned to navigate shifting allegiances. Merchants adapted to changing rulers. Clergy mediated disputes where possible. The medieval world was not perpetually engulfed in vendetta. Periods of stability and cooperation were far more common than the dramatic episodes that dominate historical memory. Revenge stands out precisely because it interrupted the ordinary. As historians, when we speak of epic revenge stories, we are identifying moments where personal grievance and political structure aligned in explosive ways. These moments illuminate fault lines between crown and nobility, church and state, dynasty and rival house. They show us where systems were most vulnerable, but they also highlight an enduring human truth. Across cultures and centuries, the impulse to respond to perceived injustice is powerful. What distinguishes historical periods is not whether that impulse exists, but how societies channel it. Medieval Europe, with its evolving institutions, offers a particularly vivid case study. It began with a strong inheritance of feud and personal honor. It gradually constructed mechanisms to contain those forces within broader legal frameworks. By the end of the medieval period, the foundations of more centralized justice were firmly in place across much of Europe. Royal courts had expanded. Written law codes carried greater authority. Diplomacy became more formalized. None of this eliminated conflict, but it changed its character. Revenge moved increasingly from private act to public prosecution. When we look back now, from the vantage point of centuries, the medieval world can appear dramatic and turbulent. Yet within that turbulence lay adaptation. Each cycle of retaliation taught lessons, sometimes painfully, about the need for clearer rules and stronger institutions. So the most epic revenge stories in medieval history are not just tales of payback. They are milestones in a larger transformation. They mark the moments when power was tested and redefined. They reveal how fragile authority could be, and how determined societies were to stabilize it. In the quiet space between battles and coronations, between exile and restoration, medieval Europe was shaping the political architecture that would influence the modern West. Revenge was part of that process, not because it was celebrated, but because it exposed the necessity of balance. And perhaps that is the enduring insight. Revenge, left unchecked, fragments. Revenge, contained within law, can reinforce order. The medieval world moved slowly from one reality toward the other. Its most dramatic stories trace that journey. One grievance, one retaliation, one turning point at a time. As we close this long journey through the most epic revenge stories of medieval history, what lingers is not simply the drama of retaliation, but the remarkable consistency of the patterns behind it. Across kingdoms, languages, and centuries, medieval Europe reveals the same underlying equation. Grievance plus power equals transformation. When a rival was humiliated at court, when a dynasty was displaced, when a city defied a crown, the response was rarely isolated. It triggered negotiations, alliances, propaganda, legal arguments, and sometimes war. Revenge, in this sense, functioned almost like a catalyst. It accelerated existing tensions. It forced decisions that might otherwise have been delayed. It clarified loyalties that had previously been ambiguous. And clarity in medieval politics was everything. In a society structured around personal bonds, ambiguity was dangerous. If a noble's loyalty seemed uncertain, it invited suspicion. If a king's authority appeared contested, it encouraged ambition. Acts of revenge, whether through confiscation, exile, military suppression, or public trial, were often attempts to eliminate that ambiguity. They drew sharp lines. They declared who stood inside the circle of power and who stood outside it. Yet drawing lines always carried risk. Every exclusion created a potential future challenger. Every punishment left behind a memory. Medieval rulers were constantly navigating between deterrence and destabilization. Some succeeded for a time. Others miscalculated and paid dearly. What makes these stories particularly compelling to modern audiences is their transparency. Medieval political life unfolded without the layers of bureaucracy and media that shape contemporary governance. Motives were debated openly in chronicles. Allegiances were visible in marriage alliances and military banners. The connection between personal insult and political consequence was often direct. That clarity allows us to see how deeply intertwined emotion and structure were. Honor was not an abstract virtue. It was a measurable asset. Reputation could command armies or dissolve them. Legitimacy, once questioned, required decisive restoration. Revenge became one of the tools used to reassert that legitimacy when other mechanisms failed. And yet, over time, societies learned that reliance on retaliation alone was unsustainable. The gradual strengthening of royal courts, clearer succession laws, and more formal diplomatic practices were not random developments. They were responses to centuries of instability fueled in part by cycles of grievance and response. In that way, medieval revenge stories do not simply entertain or shock. They illuminate the process by which political systems mature. Each dramatic episode, each deposition, each rebellion, each calculated act of retribution contributed to a broader historical evolution. Authority shifted from being primarily personal to increasingly institutional. But the human element never disappeared. Even as systems grew stronger, leaders remained aware of perception, pride, and memory. The echoes of medieval retaliation can still be traced in later European conflicts, where historical grievances were invoked to justify new actions. The past remained a reservoir of both warning and justification. So when we reflect on the most epic revenge stories of the Middle Ages, we are not just cataloging dramatic events. We are examining moments when the fragile balance of authority tipped, sometimes toward consolidation, sometimes toward collapse. They remind us that power is never static. It is negotiated, defended, and redefined continuously. And in the medieval world, revenge was one of the primary forces through which that negotiation occurred. In the end, the legacy of medieval revenge is not chaos, but transformation. Out of cycles of retaliation emerged clearer boundaries of law. Out of dynastic struggle came stronger notions of sovereignty. Out of personal grievance grew institutional justice. And that may be the quiet paradox at the heart of it all. The very forces that threatened to tear medieval societies apart also helped shape the foundations upon which later stability was built. That is why these stories endure, not merely because they are epic, but because they reveal how deeply human emotion can shape the course of history. If we take one last step back and look at the medieval world as a whole, revenge begins to look less like an exception and more like a language through which power was communicated, defended, and sometimes reimagined. In a society where written contracts were expanding but not yet universal, where centralized policing barely existed, and where loyalty was personal before it was national, actions carried enormous symbolic weight. To punish a rival publicly was to speak in a dialect everyone understood. It said, "Authority stands. Order will be enforced. Memory matters." But this language was double-edged, because medieval revenge always invited interpretation. Was the destruction of a rebellious city justice or tyranny? Was the execution of a rival noble lawful punishment or calculated elimination? Was a dynastic war rightful restoration or ambition disguised as grievance? Contemporaries rarely agreed. Chroniclers wrote from competing loyalties. One monastery preserved the memory of a king as a restorer of peace. Another described the same ruler as ruthless and vindictive. Over time, these parallel narratives shaped how entire reigns were remembered. And that is perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval revenge. It rarely ended when the act was complete. It continued in reputation. A ruler's legacy could hinge not only on whether he retaliated, but on how convincingly he framed that retaliation as necessary. The Middle Ages remind us that power is not secured by action alone. It is secured by explanation. This interplay between deed and narrative is visible in nearly every epic revenge episode we've explored. Whether in England's dynastic conflicts, France's factional rivalries, Byzantine palace coups, or the suppression of powerful orders, the decisive factor was rarely force alone. It was the ability to persuade others that force was justified. And when persuasion failed, instability followed. It is also important to recognize that medieval revenge stories often expose limits. There were boundaries rulers could not cross without consequence. Excessive retaliation could unite divided opponents. Overreaching could provoke foreign intervention. Even kings were constrained by custom, expectation, and economic reality. In this way, revenge acted as a revealing test of leadership. Some rulers demonstrated restraint, channeling punishment through legal reforms and selective pardons. Others relied heavily on fear, only to find that fear could not secure lasting loyalty. The difference often determined whether their reign would be remembered as stabilizing or destructive. By the late medieval period, Europe was visibly changing. Stronger monarchies, professional administrators, and clearer legal codes reduced reliance on personal vendetta among elites. Yet the emotional logic behind revenge, the need to defend status, restore honor, and assert legitimacy, did not vanish. It adapted. What had once been settled through feud was increasingly handled in court. What had once been answered with private war was increasingly addressed through royal decree. The method evolved, but the underlying human impulse remained familiar. And that continuity may be why medieval revenge stories continue to resonate so deeply with modern audiences in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. These societies inherited legal and political traditions shaped in part by those medieval struggles. The idea that justice must be institutional rather than personal is rooted in centuries of observing what happens when it is not. So in the end, the most epic revenge stories of medieval history are not simply tales of retaliation. They are chapters in a much larger transformation, from personal rule to institutional governance, from memory-driven feud to codified justice. They show us a world wrestling with the problem of power, who holds it, who challenges it, and how it survives challenge. And perhaps the quietest but most enduring lesson is this: revenge may ignite change, but stability requires something more: legitimacy that extends beyond fear, authority grounded not only in strength, but in shared acceptance. The medieval world learned that lesson slowly, through conflict and consequence. And in tracing those epic stories of grievance and response, we see not just drama, but the shaping of history itself. As a final meditation on these medieval revenge stories, it helps to consider the environment in which they unfolded. The Middle Ages were not static. They were centuries of demographic growth, famine, plague, economic expansion, religious reform, and technological change. Every one of those pressures amplified political tension. When resources tightened or legitimacy wavered, old grievances resurfaced quickly. The Black Death in the 14th century, for example, did not directly create revenge narratives, but it intensified social strain. Labor shortages shifted economic power. Taxation to fund wars increased resentment. When authority appeared brittle, rivals were more willing to challenge it. In such climates, retaliation often carried wider meaning. It was not just about settling a score. It was about stabilizing a shaken hierarchy. Similarly, during periods of religious upheaval, accusations themselves became tools of retribution. Charges of heresy or moral corruption could destroy reputations and dismantle networks of support. In a deeply religious society, to question someone's orthodoxy was to threaten their entire standing. While some accusations were sincerely motivated, others functioned as strategic blows in broader power struggles. The line between spiritual correction and political revenge could blur. This reveals another defining trait of medieval retaliation. It frequently operated through institutions that were themselves evolving. Royal courts, ecclesiastical tribunals, and urban councils were not neutral arenas. They were battlegrounds where influence determined outcomes. Revenge could be enacted through verdicts rather than swords. A confiscation ratified by a council carried the appearance of legality while achieving the aims of reprisal. And yet, for all its intensity, medieval revenge rarely achieved permanent closure. Dynasties rose and fell, borders shifted, but new grievances emerged in place of old ones. The process was cyclical. What changed over time was not the presence of conflict, but the mechanisms used to manage it. By the 15th century, across much of Europe, rulers increasingly emphasized continuity and stability. Coronation rituals grew more elaborate. Written bureaucracies expanded. Diplomacy became more regularized. These developments did not eliminate revenge, but they reframed it within a broader expectation of order. When we label certain episodes as the most epic revenge stories, we are often responding to their scale, the fact that they reshaped entire kingdoms. But scale alone does not explain their significance. What makes them enduring is how clearly they reveal the mechanics of medieval society. They show us how fragile authority could be when based primarily on personal bonds. They illustrate how deeply intertwined honor and governance were. And they demonstrate how, over centuries, repeated crises pushed Europe toward more formalized systems of justice. For viewers today, especially in countries shaped by common law traditions or constitutional monarchy, these stories offer historical grounding. The expectation that disputes be resolved through courts rather than private retaliation did not emerge overnight. It developed gradually, forged in response to instability. In the medieval world, revenge was often the immediate language of power. Over time, that language was disciplined, translated into statutes and procedures, but it never fully disappeared. It remained embedded in rhetoric, in political rivalry, in the human instinct to answer injury. And that is perhaps the most enduring insight. The Middle Ages were not uniquely vengeful. They were uniquely transparent about the relationship between grievance and authority. Power was personal enough that retaliation felt direct. Legitimacy was fragile enough that it required visible defense. When we look back at these epic episodes, the dynastic struggles, the calculated suppressions, the patient returns from exile, we are not simply observing dramatic history. We are watching a society learning, through trial and consequence, how to contain the most volatile elements of human behavior within structures that could endure. In the end, medieval revenge was never just about anger. It was about control over narrative, over legitimacy, over the future of a lineage or a realm. And through that struggle for control, the medieval world slowly shaped the political foundations upon which much of the modern West would later stand. As we bring this exploration to its true conclusion, it is worth pausing on one final idea. Medieval revenge was not simply a reaction to injustice. It was often a contest over who had the authority to define injustice in the first place. In the medieval world, law was not yet a fully separate, impersonal force standing above rulers. It was closely tied to them. Kings issued charters. Lords presided over courts. Bishops interpreted moral violations. Authority and judgment were intertwined. So when one ruler punished another, or when a noble retaliated against a rival, the conflict was not only about the original grievance. It was about who possessed the legitimate right to judge and to punish. That question sits quietly beneath many of the most epic revenge stories in medieval history. When Edward III asserted his claim to the French throne, he was not only challenging a king. He was challenging the French nobility's interpretation of succession law. When rival houses in England fought during the Wars of the Roses, they were not merely seeking power. They were competing interpretations of rightful inheritance. When Byzantine emperors deposed one another, each justified the act as restoration of order rather than rebellion. In every case, revenge was cloaked in legality, or at least in the language of legality. This reveals something essential about the Middle Ages. Legitimacy was never automatic. It had to be continuously reinforced. Coronations, oaths, public ceremonies, written decrees. All of these were attempts to stabilize authority in a world where personal challenge was always possible. Revenge became one of the tools used to maintain that stability. If a rival openly defied a monarch and went unpunished, the entire hierarchy could weaken. But if punishment appeared arbitrary or excessive, it could produce sympathy for the punished and undermine the ruler instead. Medieval leaders walked a narrow path. They needed to demonstrate strength without eroding the moral foundation of their power. This is why so many acts of retaliation were framed as reluctant necessities. Chronicles frequently describe rulers as forced into action by treachery or disorder. Even when motives were clearly political, the narrative emphasized duty: to restore peace, to defend the realm, to correct injustice, and sometimes these narratives were believed. Medieval societies did not view all revenge as immoral. They distinguished between uncontrolled vendetta and sanctioned punishment. The latter, when executed within accepted norms, could strengthen communal trust. The former threatened endless instability. Over time, that distinction became increasingly formalized. The rise of royal justice systems in England, France, and elsewhere gradually restricted private warfare. Nobles who once might have pursued feuds were required to submit disputes to royal courts. This was not simply a moral evolution, it was a political one. Central authorities sought monopoly over violence. In that shift, we can see the long-term impact of centuries of retaliatory cycles. Each destructive feud, each dynastic war, each destabilizing deposition underscored the dangers of personalized justice. Gradually, rulers and subjects alike began to prefer predictable legal structures over uncertain vengeance. And yet, the emotional architecture never disappeared. Even in later centuries, political rhetoric continued to draw upon themes familiar from medieval revenge: betrayal, restoration, rightful claim, moral correction. The language evolved, but the underlying impulses remained human and recognizable. So what, ultimately, makes these stories epic? It is not merely scale or spectacle. It is consequence. Medieval revenge stories changed borders, dismantled institutions, reshaped dynasties, and accelerated the development of governance. They illuminate moments when authority faltered and was either rebuilt or replaced. They also remind us that history is rarely driven by abstract forces alone. It is driven by individuals responding to perceived injury, ambition, fear, and memory, all operating within structures that either contain or amplify those responses. In the medieval world, where institutions were still solidifying, those responses had extraordinary reach. A banquet could shift the balance of noble power. A disputed inheritance could ignite a century of war. A calculated suppression could eliminate an order that spanned continents. A deposition could redefine the relationship between crown and law. Each began with grievance. Each ended by altering the political landscape. And perhaps that is the final, quiet truth behind the most epic revenge stories of medieval history. They reveal a world in the process of learning how to manage power responsibly. Revenge exposed weaknesses in authority. It revealed gaps in law. It forced societies to confront the costs of instability. And through repeated confrontation with those costs, medieval Europe slowly moved toward stronger, more centralized systems of governance. The Middle Ages were not simply an age of vengeance. They were an age of transition. In tracing these stories carefully, without sensationalism, without exaggeration, we see not only dramatic turning points, but the steady construction of political order. And that is why they endure, not because they are violent or shocking, but because they show how deeply human impulses shaped the foundations of the modern world. From personal insult to institutional reform, from feud to formal justice, the arc of medieval revenge is, in many ways, the arc of medieval history itself. And in understanding it, we understand far more than retaliation. we understand transformation. As we settle into the final moments of this documentary, it's worth reflecting not on a single king, battle, or betrayal, but on the emotional atmosphere of the medieval world itself. Because what truly made revenge such a powerful force in medieval history was not simply ambition or cruelty. It was vulnerability. Medieval societies were structurally fragile. Communication was slow. Central authority was limited. Economies were regional. Armies were often temporary and loyalty-based. In that environment, power depended on perception more than infrastructure. If you appeared strong, you remained strong. If you appeared weak, challenges multiplied. That fragility explains why retaliation so often seemed necessary. A lord whose castle was seized without response risked losing the loyalty of his vassals. A king who ignored rebellion risked appearing incapable of defending the realm. A noble house that failed to avenge a murdered kinsman risked long-term humiliation and marginalization. In each case, revenge functioned as a corrective mechanism, an attempt to reassert credibility in a world where credibility was survival. But here lies the paradox. The very acts meant to secure authority could also undermine it. When retaliation escalated into prolonged war, it drained treasuries and exhausted populations. When punishment appeared excessive, it created sympathy for the punished. When dynastic disputes turned violent, they invited foreign intervention. Medieval revenge was always walking a tightrope between restoration and destabilization. Over time, this repeated pattern forced adaptation. Rulers began to understand that visible justice, structured, ritualized, and legally justified, was more sustainable than open vendetta. Public trials replaced private executions. Written charters replaced informal settlements. Oaths were documented. Councils expanded. Governance slowly shifted from personality to procedure. This transformation did not happen evenly or peacefully. It unfolded through crisis. Each major episode of revenge, whether in the courts of France, the battlefields of England, the palace intrigues of Byzantium, or the feuding cities of Italy, revealed the limitations of personal power. And each limitation encouraged stronger institutional frameworks. By the late medieval period, Europe was markedly different from its early medieval predecessor. Monarchies were more centralized, bureaucracies more permanent, tax systems more predictable. While conflict remained, it was increasingly mediated through diplomatic channels and formal alliances. And yet, the legacy of medieval revenge never vanished. It survived in literature, epic poems and chronicles that shaped national memory. It survived in political rhetoric, where leaders invoked historical grievance to justify new action. It survived in symbolism, coats of arms, royal marriages, and ceremonial acts that quietly referenced past conflicts resolved or avenged. In this way, medieval revenge became part of Europe's political DNA. For modern viewers in countries shaped by these historical trajectories, these stories offer more than dramatic entertainment. They provide context. The legal systems that emphasize due process, the expectation that justice must appear impartial, the suspicion of concentrated personal authority. All of these principles were forged in response to centuries when revenge blurred dangerously with governance. The Middle Ages remind us that stability is not automatic. It is built through repeated confrontation with instability. The most epic revenge stories of medieval history are, at their core, stories of testing. testing of legitimacy, testing of loyalty, testing of institutional strength. Some rulers passed those tests and consolidated power. Others failed and were replaced. But every episode contributed to the slow shaping of political order. And perhaps the quietest lesson of all is this: revenge in the medieval world was rarely irrational. It was often calculated, strategic, and deeply embedded in social norms. What changed over time was not human nature, but the systems surrounding it. As institutions strengthened, the need for personal retaliation diminished. Authority became less dependent on spectacle and more dependent on structure. Law gradually separated itself from individual will. The castles still stand in stone across Europe. The chronicles still preserve tales of betrayal and triumph. But behind those dramatic moments lies a broader narrative, one of transformation. Medieval revenge was not simply about settling scores. It was about defining power in a world where power was still being invented. And through centuries of grievance, retaliation, reconciliation, and reform, that definition slowly became clearer. That is why these stories endure, not just because they are epic, but because they reveal how fragile systems mature, how authority is contested, and how, out of conflict, enduring structures emerge. In understanding medieval revenge, we understand not only the passions of the past, but the foundations of the present. And perhaps, as a final layer to this long exploration, we should consider what medieval revenge teaches us about memory itself. Because in the Middle Ages, memory was political. Unlike the modern world, where information moves instantly and records are centralized, medieval memory was curated carefully. Monasteries preserved chronicles. Royal courts commissioned histories. Noble families guarded genealogies. The past was not simply remembered, it was shaped. When a ruler carried out an act of retaliation, the immediate outcome mattered. But equally important was how that act would be written about, retold, and interpreted by future generations. Medieval revenge was never just about defeating an opponent. It was about securing a narrative. A king who destroyed a rebellious city might describe his action as restoring divine order. A rival faction might record the same event as unjust brutality. Over decades, one version might dominate, especially if backed by stable power. In that sense, the most successful acts of revenge were those that controlled not only territory but history. This is why so many medieval rulers invested in ceremony and symbolism after conflict. Victories were followed by public coronations, thanksgiving services, and formal reconciliations. These rituals were not decorative. They were narrative tools. They signaled closure. They redefined events as necessary steps toward stability rather than as cycles of endless hostility. And yet, memory has its own resilience. Even when a dynasty was overthrown, its story often survived through loyal chroniclers or displaced heirs. The grievances of one generation could be preserved in exile, waiting for favorable political winds. In some cases, centuries-old claims resurfaced because they had been carefully documented and protected. This long continuity of grievance explains why medieval revenge could feel almost timeless. Conflicts were not always spontaneous. They were often the culmination of layered resentments, inherited disputes, and unresolved questions of legitimacy. And that layering is what gives these stories their epic scale. A dispute that began as a succession question could evolve into decades of intermittent warfare. A confiscation meant to silence a rival could inspire a coalition of opposition. A single execution could echo across borders through alliances and kinship networks. The medieval world was interconnected through bloodlines, trade routes, religious authority, and diplomatic ties. Revenge in one court rarely remained confined there. It traveled through marriage alliances, papal correspondence, and military pacts. At the same time, it is important to remember that medieval societies were not defined solely by vengeance. They were also defined by resilience and negotiation. For every dramatic act of retaliation, there were countless instances of compromise, mediation, and pragmatic peace. The very existence of medieval treaties, truces, and reconciliations demonstrates that people understood the limits of revenge. They knew that unending retaliation could hollow out economies, depopulate regions, and weaken kingdoms against external threats. And so, gradually, a cultural shift emerged. Authority became more closely associated with predictable justice rather than personal retaliation. Legitimacy increasingly required institutional support rather than family force alone. Written law codes expanded. Administrative offices became more specialized. Kings relied less on personal vendetta and more on bureaucratic procedure. This shift did not eliminate conflict. It refined it. By the close of the medieval period, Europe was entering a new political era. Monarchies were stronger. States were more centralized. Diplomatic practices were formalizing. The impulse for revenge remained part of human nature, but its expression was increasingly constrained by structured systems. Looking back, the most epic revenge stories of medieval history reveal a world in motion. They capture moments when old norms collided with emerging institutions. They show us how fragile authority can be when built primarily on personal bonds, and how enduring it becomes when anchored in law and collective acceptance. For viewers today, these stories resonate not because we live in a world of feudal vendetta, but because we still grapple with questions of legitimacy, justice, and authority. The medieval world confronted those questions without the institutional safeguards we now assume. And through conflict, sometimes tragic, sometimes transformative, it built those safeguards piece by piece. So in the end, medieval revenge is not just a series of dramatic episodes. It is a mirror reflecting the long evolution of governance. It reminds us that stability is earned through hard lessons, that unchecked retaliation fractures societies, and that true authority must eventually rise above personal grievance. The castles, the battlefields, the chronicles, they all preserve fragments of this journey. And when we trace the arc from feud to formal justice, from personal retaliation to institutional order, we are not just studying the Middle Ages. We are witnessing the slow construction of the political foundations that continue to shape the modern world. If we allow ourselves one final reflection, it may be this: medieval revenge endures in our imagination because it exposes power at its most human. Strip away the crowns, the armor, the stone fortresses, and what remains are individuals responding to threat, humiliation, ambition, and fear. The medieval world did not hide those impulses behind layers of bureaucracy. It revealed them plainly. Authority was embodied in a person. Legitimacy rested in a bloodline. Insult was directed at a face, not an abstract office. That immediacy is what gives medieval revenge its intensity. But it is also what makes it instructive. Because when authority is personal, retaliation becomes personal. And when retaliation becomes personal, its consequences ripple outward unpredictably. Families divide, regions fracture, alliances shift. What begins as a response to injury can reshape entire political landscapes. Across Europe, from the British Isles to the Italian peninsula, from the courts of France to the palaces of Byzantium, we see the same pattern repeated. A challenge emerges over succession, territory, influence, or honor. The response is calculated, often justified as lawful necessity. The immediate threat may be neutralized, but the memory lingers. And memory in the medieval world was powerful currency. It was preserved in monastery archives, in family genealogies, in songs and stories passed between generations, could justify future claims, could inspire renewed conflict, could strengthen identity. In many ways, medieval revenge was not about the past at all. It was about controlling the future. A successful act of retaliation did more than settle a score. It redefined who belonged within the circle of power. It redrew political maps. It reshaped alliances, created precedents. Over time, those precedents accumulated. Rulers learned what methods produced stability and which provoked collapse. They observed how excessive retaliation could unite enemies, while measured enforcement could secure loyalty. Slowly, unevenly, governance adapted. The shift from feud to formal justice did not happen because human beings became less emotional. It happened because repeated cycles of revenge demonstrated their cost. The devastation of prolonged dynastic wars, the instability of contested successions, the fragmentation of authority. All of these taught lessons that no treatise alone could convey. By the late medieval period, the groundwork for stronger state structures had been laid. Royal courts claimed broader jurisdiction. Written law gained prominence. Military power became more centralized. Diplomacy matured into a system of negotiated equilibrium. None of this erased conflict, but it changed the way conflict was managed. And that transformation is perhaps the most epic story of all. The Middle Ages began in a world where retaliation was often the default mechanism of justice. They ended in a world increasingly defined by institutional authority. Between those two realities lies a long arc of adaptation, shaped in no small part by the very revenge stories we have traced. For modern audiences, these narratives resonate not because we admire vengeance, but because we recognize the tension they embody. The desire for redress remains universal. The challenge is how to pursue it without destabilizing the structures that protect us. The medieval world confronted that challenge repeatedly, sometimes with wisdom, sometimes with catastrophe. And in doing so, it laid foundations. So when we look back at the most epic revenge stories in medieval history, we are not simply observing moments of retaliation. We are witnessing pressure points, moments when systems were tested and either fractured or strengthened. They remind us that governance is never static. It evolves under strain. It learns from crisis. It refines itself through experience. The castles and chronicles give us the drama. The deeper pattern gives us understanding. Medieval revenge was never merely spectacle. It was a force that shaped institutions, redefined legitimacy, and accelerated political development. And in tracing that force carefully, calmly, without exaggeration, we see something far more compelling than simple payback. We see a civilization wrestling with power, responsibility, and memory, and through that struggle shaping the world that would follow. If we linger just a little longer, there is one final dimension of medieval revenge that deserves attention: scale. Not scale in terms of violence or spectacle, but scale in consequence. In the medieval world, the actions of a relatively small number of individuals could alter the trajectory of entire regions. Political power was concentrated. A king's decision, a duke's rebellion, a bishop's denunciation. These were not symbolic gestures. They carried immediate structural weight. And when those actions were motivated by retaliation, the results could cascade far beyond the original grievance. Consider how often medieval revenge began with something narrowly defined: a disputed inheritance, a broken oath, an insult at court, a contested marriage alliance. Each of these might appear limited in scope, but because medieval society was woven together through kinship networks and layered loyalties, any fracture could widen rapidly. A contested succession did not remain confined to one household. It drew in allies, foreign rulers, church authorities, and economic interests. A punitive campaign against a rebellious city could disrupt trade routes and affect neighboring territories. A deposition in one kingdom could embolden rivals in another. The medieval political world was interconnected in ways that are sometimes underestimated. Dynasties intermarried across borders. Nobles held lands in multiple realms. The church operated as a transnational institution. In such an environment, revenge rarely remained local. This interconnectedness gave medieval retaliation its epic quality. Not because the actors always intended sweeping consequences, but because the system amplified their decisions. And yet, amid this volatility, medieval societies were not without restraint. Custom and ritual acted as stabilizing forces. Even in moments of intense retaliation, there were expectations about proportionality and legitimacy. Nobles understood that outright annihilation of rival bloodlines could provoke broader instability. Kings recognized that mercy, strategically applied, could convert former enemies into loyal subjects. This balancing act was not always successful, but it demonstrates that medieval revenge operated within norms. It was not pure chaos. It was a structured response within a structured society. What ultimately changed across the medieval centuries was the increasing capacity of institutions to absorb conflict. Early in the period, disputes might escalate quickly into armed feud. Later, similar disputes were more likely to move through formal legal channels. Royal courts expanded their reach. Written documentation strengthened claims. Arbitration and diplomacy became more common tools. In this sense, medieval revenge can be seen as a catalyst for institutional growth. Each destructive episode highlighted the cost of insufficient central authority. Each prolonged war revealed the economic strain of decentralized retaliation. Each succession crisis underscored the need for clearer legal frameworks. The response to these lessons was gradual but decisive. By the 15th century, many European polities were noticeably more centralized than they had been centuries earlier. Monarchies commanded more consistent taxation. Bureaucracies tracked records more reliably. Standing military forces reduced reliance on private levies. The transformation was incomplete and uneven, but real. And so, when we look back at the most epic revenge stories of medieval history, we are witnessing more than dramatic turning points. We are observing moments when systems failed and were forced to adapt. The emotional impulse behind revenge did not disappear. It was channeled. Where once a slight might have sparked a feud between noble houses, later it might trigger litigation. Where once a contested claim might have meant immediate war, later it could involve diplomatic negotiation backed by treaty. This evolution did not eliminate ambition or rivalry, but it gradually reduced the scale of unpredictable retaliation. In the end, medieval revenge reveals something fundamental about political development. Stability is not born from idealism alone. It is born from experience. It is forged in response to repeated crises that expose weaknesses. The Middle Ages provided many such crises. From dynastic struggles in England and France to palace intrigues in Byzantium, from factional violence in Italian cities to succession disputes in Iberia and Scandinavia, retaliation was a recurring force. And each recurrence taught hard lessons about the need for clearer authority and stronger systems. That is why these stories remain compelling. They are not simply tales of vengeance. They are chapters in the long formation of governance. They show us that human impulses, ambition, resentment, pride, do not disappear. What changes is how societies manage them. The medieval world managed them imperfectly, sometimes catastrophically. But through that imperfection, it moved steadily toward more durable political structures. And in tracing the arc of revenge across those centuries, we glimpse the deeper arc of history itself. An arc shaped not only by ideals, but by conflict, adaptation, and the slow refinement of power. If we allow ourselves one final, wider lens, we begin to see that medieval revenge was not only a political force, it was a cultural expectation. It was embedded in codes of honor, in chivalric ideals, in legal traditions that stretched back to Germanic custom and Roman jurisprudence alike. To leave a grave insult unanswered was not merely a personal choice. It could be interpreted as weakness, even moral failure. In early medieval law codes, compensation systems attempted to regulate retaliation. The concept of wergild, financial payment for injury or death, was designed to prevent endless blood feuds. Even here, however, we see how deeply normalized the logic of revenge was. The goal was not to eliminate retaliation, but to channel it into predictable, socially accepted forms. As centuries passed, those compensation systems evolved into more formal judicial frameworks. Yet the underlying tension remained. Justice needed to satisfy the injured party while preserving communal stability. Medieval rulers were constantly navigating that tension. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the theater of public punishment. Executions, confiscations, ritual humiliations. These were not hidden events. They were staged. They were witnessed. They were meant to communicate something unmistakable, that authority had prevailed. But the performance itself was delicate. Too much severity could create martyrs. Too little firmness could invite further defiance. Medieval rulers understood that retaliation was not only about removing a rival, it was about shaping the emotional climate of the realm. This emotional climate was critical in societies where loyalty was personal. A lord's followers did not serve an abstract constitution. They served a person. Their willingness to remain loyal depended on confidence in that person's strength and fairness. So revenge became a signal. When handled strategically, it reinforced hierarchy. When mishandled, it fractured it. Over time, as monarchies consolidated, a gradual shift occurred. The right to retaliate, once distributed among noble families, was increasingly monopolized by central authority. Private warfare was restricted. Royal courts claimed jurisdiction over disputes that once would have sparked feud. This was not simply moral progress. It was political centralization. The state, slowly and unevenly, claimed ownership over justice. In doing so, it reduced the legitimacy of personal vendetta. The emotional impulse for revenge did not disappear, but its acceptable expression narrowed. By the late medieval period, rulers were less likely to justify actions as vengeance and more likely to describe them as enforcement of law. The language changed, and language matters, because language shapes legitimacy. When retaliation is framed as law, it gains institutional backing. When it is framed as personal revenge, it risks instability. Medieval societies gradually learned that distinction through experience, often costly experience. And yet, even as institutions strengthened, the memory of earlier cycles endured. The epic revenge stories of the Middle Ages became cautionary tales. Chroniclers described the devastation of prolonged dynastic wars. Poets reflected on the tragic consequences of unchecked ambition. Political thinkers increasingly emphasized order, continuity, and the dangers of faction. In this way, revenge served as both catalyst and warning. It exposed the vulnerabilities of decentralized authority. It demonstrated the economic and social cost of sustained conflict. And it highlighted the need for predictable mechanisms of succession and dispute resolution. What makes medieval revenge stories so enduring is not their violence, but their clarity. They reveal systems under strain. They show us what happens when legitimacy falters. They illustrate how fragile political order can be when authority rests heavily on personal bonds. But they also show resilience. Out of repeated crisis came adaptation. Out of feud came formal court systems. Out of contested succession came clearer hereditary principles. Out of factional rivalry came stronger central states. This transformation was gradual, incomplete, and uneven across Europe. But it was real. And so, when we reflect on the most epic revenge stories in medieval history, we are not merely recounting dramatic confrontations. We are tracing a long developmental arc. A world that began with deeply personal justice slowly moved toward institutionalized governance. A society that once normalized feud gradually restricted it. A political order built on individual strength increasingly relied on structured law. Revenge, in this context, becomes more than a dramatic theme. It becomes a diagnostic tool, a way of identifying where systems were weakest, where authority was contested, where legitimacy required reinforcement. And perhaps that is the most important takeaway. Medieval revenge was never just about settling scores. It was about defining who held power and under what conditions that power could be challenged. Through centuries of conflict, Europe experimented, sometimes painfully, with different answers to that question. And the legacy of those experiments still shapes the political frameworks familiar to us today. The castles may stand as silent monuments. The chronicles may preserve the names of kings and rivals long gone. But beneath those names lies a deeper story, one of transformation forged in the crucible of grievance and response. In understanding medieval revenge, we do not simply understand retaliation. We understand the slow, hard-earned construction of political order itself. And if we trace that construction all the way to its quiet conclusion, we arrive at something almost paradoxical. Medieval revenge, for all its intensity, ultimately helped define the limits of revenge itself. Every time a feud spiraled into prolonged warfare, it demonstrated the economic cost of instability. Crops went unharvested, trade routes were disrupted, tax revenues collapsed. Every time a disputed succession fractured a kingdom, it exposed how dangerous ambiguity could be. Every time a ruler punished too harshly and provoked rebellion, it revealed the boundaries of acceptable force. In other words, medieval revenge acted as a repeated experiment. What happens if authority relies too heavily on fear? What happens if succession is unclear? What happens if grievances are left unresolved? What happens if retaliation becomes excessive? The answers were rarely theoretical. They were written in famine, depopulation, and weakened crowns. Gradually, rulers and political communities absorbed those lessons. Not all at once and not uniformly across Europe, but steadily enough that, by the end of the medieval period, the political landscape had changed significantly from its early centuries. Succession laws became more defined. Representative assemblies, such as parliaments and estates, gained clearer roles in taxation and consent. Royal justice expanded its jurisdiction. Diplomatic negotiation became a standard feature of interstate relations rather than an occasional improvisation. Revenge did not disappear, but it became constrained. Where once a powerful noble might have raised private armies to settle a score, later he was more likely to pursue his claim through court or council. Where once a king might have executed rivals with minimal explanation, later he required formal charges and visible procedures to preserve legitimacy. The shift was not moral perfection. It was structural necessity. And this structural evolution is what makes the most epic revenge stories of medieval history so revealing. They mark the moments when systems were forced to confront their own fragility. Take the long Anglo-French rivalry. What began as a dynastic grievance evolved into a prolonged geopolitical struggle that reshaped military organization, taxation systems, and national identity. By its end, both kingdoms were more centralized and administratively developed than they had been at its beginning. Or consider the dynastic wars within England. The repeated cycles of deposition and restoration during the 15th century made painfully clear the dangers of unclear succession and factional dominance. The eventual consolidation under the Tudor dynasty relied heavily on reinforcing royal authority while avoiding the open vendettas that had destabilized earlier reigns. In each case, revenge exposed fault lines. And once exposed, those fault lines demanded reinforcement. This is perhaps the deepest reason why medieval revenge feels epic. It was transformative. It did not simply remove individuals from power. It reshaped institutions. At the same time, it reminds us of something enduring about political life. Authority is always negotiated. Legitimacy must be maintained. Grievances do not vanish simply because they are inconvenient. The medieval world confronted these realities without the safeguards modern states often take for granted. It relied on ritual, oath, lineage, and visible enforcement. And when those mechanisms failed, retaliation filled the vacuum. Yet out of those failures came adaptation. The Middle Ages were not a static era of endless vendetta. They were centuries of political experimentation under pressure. Each dramatic act of revenge, each contested claim, each punitive campaign added to a growing body of lived experience about the costs of instability. And over time, that experience reshaped governance. So when we look back at the most epic revenge stories of medieval history, we are not indulging in tales of anger. We are examining turning points, moments when authority was challenged and either fractured or strengthened. They reveal the emotional engine behind political transformation. They show how personal grievance can ripple outward into structural reform. They illustrate how fragile systems mature under strain. In the end, medieval revenge was both destructive and constructive. It destabilized realms in the short term, but in the long term, it contributed to the gradual consolidation of power into more predictable and institutional forms. That is the quiet arc beneath the drama. From feud to formal justice, from personal retaliation to centralized authority, from inherited grievance to codified law. The Middle Ages did not eliminate revenge. They redefined its place within society. And in doing so, they shaped the political architecture that much of the modern Western world still inhabits. So when we step back from the castles, the battlefields, the dynastic rivalries, and the carefully recorded grievances, we see something larger. We see a civilization learning, sometimes painfully, how to govern itself. And that, perhaps, is the most epic story of all. As we take one final, measured look across the medieval landscape, what becomes increasingly clear is that revenge was rarely the beginning of a story. More often, it was the midpoint, the moment when pressure that had been building quietly finally surfaced. Before a castle was besieged, there had been whispered grievances. Before a rival claimant declared himself rightful king, there had been years of negotiation and resentment. Before a city was punished, there had been resistance, taxation disputes, and strained loyalties. Revenge was visible, dramatic, and decisive, but it was almost always the culmination of deeper structural tension. This perspective changes how we understand the so-called epic nature of these stories. They are not epic simply because they are dramatic. They are epic because they mark transitions. They represent the breaking point where informal systems of compromise no longer held, and formal authority had to assert itself, sometimes forcefully. In early medieval Europe, political order depended heavily on personal bonds. Lords and vassals were tied together through oath and mutual obligation. Kingship itself often relied on consensus among powerful elites. When those bonds frayed, there were few neutral institutions strong enough to intervene. Retaliation filled the vacuum. But as centuries passed, rulers increasingly recognized that sustainable authority required something more than reactive force. It required predictability, predictable succession, predictable taxation, predictable justice. Without predictability, every grievance risked escalation. And so we see a slow shift. Written records become more common. Royal courts claim broader jurisdiction. Assemblies and councils formalize consultation. Even warfare becomes more regulated through truces, ransom customs, and diplomatic norms. None of these developments eliminated revenge as a human impulse, but they reduced its unpredictability. By the later Middle Ages, retaliation was more often framed as lawful correction rather than personal vendetta. The symbolism changed. The procedures expanded. The language became more institutional, yet the memory of earlier cycles remained powerful. Chroniclers repeatedly emphasized the dangers of faction. Political thinkers warned about the instability of divided sovereignty. Rulers invoked the need for unity and order in ways that reflected centuries of lived experience with the consequences of unrestrained retaliation. In this sense, medieval revenge shaped political consciousness itself. It taught elites that honor could not be defended at the cost of total instability. It taught rulers that legitimacy required visible fairness. It taught communities that unchecked feud weakened collective strength. Over time, those lessons hardened into expectations. By the threshold of the early modern period, the idea that justice should flow from centralized authority rather than private retaliation was far more deeply rooted than it had been centuries earlier. The transformation was incomplete and uneven, but unmistakable. And yet, even as systems strengthened, the emotional architecture of revenge continued to echo through history. National rivalries drew upon centuries-old grievances. Dynastic propaganda referenced ancestral wrongs. Political rhetoric invoked betrayal and restoration in language familiar to medieval ears. The difference was structural. Where once a grievance might ignite immediate armed response, it was increasingly filtered through diplomatic negotiation or institutional adjudication. This evolution underscores the broader historical arc we have traced. Medieval revenge was not an anomaly. It was a mechanism through which societies confronted weaknesses in their own political design. Each cycle of retaliation exposed structural gaps. Each crisis demanded adaptation. The epic scale of these stories lies not in spectacle alone, but in consequence. A contested inheritance could trigger war. A public humiliation could destabilize alliances. A calculated suppression could dissolve powerful institutions. But from those disruptions came consolidation. From those fractures came reform. From those grievances came stronger frameworks. In that way, medieval revenge occupies a paradoxical place in history. It was destructive yet generative. It destabilized, yet it forced stabilization. It fractured authority, yet it accelerated its centralization. And perhaps that is why these stories remain so compelling for modern audiences. They reveal how human emotion, pride, resentment, ambition, intersects with institutional development. They show us that political systems are not built in calm isolation. They are forged under pressure. The Middle Ages were centuries of such pressure. And through dynastic wars, palace coups, factional rivalries, and carefully justified acts of retaliation, Europe gradually reshaped its political foundations. So when we consider the most epic revenge stories in medieval history, we are not simply recounting dramatic episodes. We are witnessing a civilization learning through conflict how to balance power with order, authority with legitimacy, and justice with restraint. In understanding that process, we understand far more than vengeance. We understand the slow maturation of governance itself, and that quiet transformation, unfolding across centuries, may be the most epic story of all. As we settle into the final reflections of this long journey, it becomes clear that medieval revenge, at its deepest level, was about legitimacy under pressure. In a world without modern constitutions, without standing bureaucracies capable of absorbing shock, legitimacy had to be visible. It had to be reinforced through ritual, force, law, and narrative. When that legitimacy was challenged, retaliation was often the chosen instrument of repair. But legitimacy is a fragile thing. It depends on belief that the ruler has a rightful claim, belief that justice is being administered fairly, belief that the political order is stable enough to protect its people. Medieval revenge stories reveal what happens when that belief falters. A disputed succession was not merely a technical problem. It was a crack in collective confidence. A rival claimant did not just threaten territory. He threatened the shared understanding of who should rule. Retaliation in such moments was less about anger and more about reassertion. A visible attempt to restore clarity. And clarity was power. When Edward III challenged the French crown, he was not simply expressing personal grievance. He was attempting to redefine legitimacy itself. When rival houses in England fought for supremacy, each claimed lawful inheritance. When emperors in Byzantium deposed one another, they framed their actions as restoration of rightful order. Each act of revenge was wrapped in legal and moral language because authority required justification. This constant need for justification gradually reshaped political behavior. Rulers learned that force without explanation could not sustain loyalty. They needed councils, clerical endorsement, written proclamations. They needed ceremony. Over centuries, this produced a subtle but decisive shift. Governance became increasingly procedural. Where once an act of retaliation might have been justified primarily by strength, later it required documentation and ritual validation. Public trials replaced summary punishments. Councils recorded decisions. Legal precedent accumulated. Revenge did not disappear, but it moved within tighter boundaries. And those boundaries mattered. They created expectations among elites and, gradually, among broader populations. Justice became associated not merely with outcome, but with process. Authority became tied not only to lineage, but to administrative competence. This was not a smooth or peaceful evolution. It was forged in repeated crises. Dynastic wars exposed weaknesses in succession law. Factional violence revealed the dangers of decentralized enforcement. Repeated cycles of rebellion demonstrated the cost of unrestrained retaliation. Each episode added weight to the argument for stronger central authority. By the late medieval period, many European kingdoms had begun to resemble early states rather than loose feudal networks. Royal courts extended their reach. Tax systems became more reliable. Diplomacy grew more systematic. Warfare itself became more organized. And beneath all of this structural change lay centuries of lived experience with the consequences of revenge. The epic stories we remember, the rival claimants, the contested thrones, the calculated suppressions, are not isolated dramas. They are milestones in a longer transformation. They remind us that political order is rarely built in tranquility. It is shaped by tension. It matures through trial. It adapts because it must. The medieval world confronted the problem of power in its most personal form. Kings embodied the state. Noble families embodied regional authority. Insult to one could destabilize many. But through repeated confrontation with that fragility, Europe moved toward more durable frameworks. Revenge, paradoxically, played a role in that maturation. It exposed where authority lacked clarity. It revealed where law needed strengthening. It forced rulers to consider not only how to punish, but how to justify. And justification is the seed of institutional legitimacy. When we look back now, the castles and battlefields capture attention. The rivalries and betrayals draw us in. But beneath them lies a quieter story, one of adaptation and consolidation. The Middle Ages began with a political culture comfortable with feud as a form of justice. They ended with a political culture increasingly committed to centralized adjudication. The journey between those points was neither linear nor peaceful. It was shaped by human emotion, ambition, pride, and fear, but it was also shaped by learning. And that learning is the true epic arc of medieval revenge. It is not simply the story of retaliation. It is the story of a civilization gradually redefining how power should be exercised and contained. From contested crowns to consolidated monarchies, from personal vendetta to institutional justice, the medieval centuries forged political habits that continue to influence the modern world. So when we consider the most epic revenge stories of medieval history, we are not simply looking backward at dramatic events. We are tracing the slow formation of political order itself, an order tested repeatedly by grievance, strengthened by necessity, and refined by experience. And that enduring transformation may be the most powerful legacy the medieval world left behind. If we bring everything together one last time, we arrive at a simple but profound realization. Medieval revenge was rarely about the past alone. It was always about the future. When a ruler punished a rival, when a noble avenged a family insult, when a dynasty fought to reclaim a throne, the immediate grievance mattered, but the deeper concern was continuity. Who would rule next? Which bloodline would survive? What precedent would be set? What message would echo across generations? The medieval world was intensely aware of legacy. Power was hereditary. Land was inherited. Titles passed through bloodlines. Memory itself was preserved deliberately in chronicles and charters. In such a world, revenge was not simply an emotional reaction. It was a strategic intervention in the flow of inheritance. To avenge a father was to defend a lineage. To depose a rival was to secure succession. To punish rebellion was to reinforce dynastic continuity. Every act of retaliation carried forward-looking consequences. This is why medieval revenge so often reshaped institutions. When cycles of retaliation threatened the survival of kingdoms, rulers were forced to reconsider the structures that allowed those cycles to begin. Repeated succession disputes led to clearer inheritance customs. Repeated noble feuds encouraged stronger royal courts. Repeated factional conflicts prompted broader administrative reform. In each case, the medieval world was responding not to abstract theory, but to lived instability. And instability was costly. It drained treasuries. It disrupted harvests. It weakened borders. It invited foreign opportunism. Even the most ambitious rulers eventually recognized that perpetual retaliation could undermine the very authority they sought to protect. Over time, a cultural shift took place. Authority began to root itself more firmly in law and procedure than in personality alone. Royal power expanded not simply through conquest, but through bureaucratic consistency. Governance became something that extended beyond the lifespan of any single monarch. Yet the emotional core remained familiar. Honor still mattered. Legitimacy still mattered. Memory still mattered. What changed was the method of response. Where once revenge might have meant private war, it increasingly meant formal prosecution. Where once a rival might be eliminated quietly, he was now more often tried publicly. Where once disputes lingered unresolved across generations, they were increasingly codified and adjudicated. The transformation was incomplete. History never offers clean endings, but it was substantial. The epic revenge stories of medieval history mark the pressure points in that transformation. They reveal the moments when inherited systems proved insufficient. They show how human impulse collided with structural limitation. And perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate that political development is rarely born of calm deliberation. It emerges through conflict, miscalculation, correction, and adaptation. The Middle Ages were centuries of negotiation between emotion and order. At the start of the period, feud and retaliation were normalized responses within many communities. By the end, centralized authority and institutional justice had become far more dominant. The path between those two realities was neither straight nor smooth, but it was unmistakable. For modern audiences, these stories resonate because they reveal something timeless. The desire for redress when wronged has never disappeared. The challenge is always how to pursue justice without destabilizing the broader system. Medieval Europe wrestled openly with that challenge. Its rulers tested the limits of force. Its nobles tested the limits of loyalty. Its institutions tested the limits of endurance. And through those tests, governance evolved. So when we reflect on the most epic revenge stories of medieval history, we are not celebrating vengeance. We are studying transformation. We are watching a civilization confront its own fragility and slowly construct stronger frameworks to contain it. The castles, the coronations, the rival claimants, they are the visible surface. Beneath them lies the deeper current, the steady, hard-earned development of political order. Revenge was one of the forces that accelerated that development. It exposed weaknesses, clarified stakes, forced adaptation. In the end, the medieval world did not eliminate revenge, it disciplined it. And in doing so, it laid foundations that would carry forward into the early modern state and beyond. That is why these stories endure. Not because they are loud, not because they are violent, but because they illuminate how power is tested and how, through that testing, it matures. And in understanding that maturation, we understand far more than the Middle Ages. We understand the long, complex journey from personal rule to institutional governance. A journey shaped, in no small part, by the epic cycles of grievance and response that defined medieval history. As we reach the very end of this extended exploration, there is one final perspective worth considering, perhaps the most human of all. Medieval revenge stories endure not only because they reshaped kingdoms, but because they expose the tension between emotion and responsibility at the highest levels of power. The men and women at the center of these stories were not abstract symbols. They were rulers, heirs, siblings, rivals, individuals navigating environments where personal insult could destabilize entire realms. And that pressure was immense. A medieval monarch did not rule from behind institutional distance. Authority was embodied in the sovereign's person. To question the ruler's legitimacy was to question the entire structure of governance. In such a world, retaliation could feel less like choice and more like obligation. If a rival claimant spread doubt, silence might be interpreted as weakness. If a noble rebelled and went unpunished, loyalty elsewhere might erode. If a disputed succession lingered unresolved, factions would form. The act of revenge, whether through military suppression, political maneuvering, or legal prosecution, was often framed as defense of order itself. But even when framed as necessity, retaliation carried moral risk. Medieval Christian teaching consistently emphasized forgiveness and restraint. Clergy preached against wrath and pride. Yet secular authority required enforcement. This tension ran quietly through the era. Rulers were expected to defend justice, but not to indulge cruelty. They were expected to punish wrongdoing, but not to appear vindictive. Walking that line was extraordinarily difficult. History preserves examples of rulers who managed it carefully, using calculated clemency to secure loyalty. It also preserves examples of rulers who leaned too heavily into retribution and paid the price in rebellion or deposition. Over centuries, repeated experience taught a consistent lesson. Power sustained by fear alone is brittle. Revenge could silence opposition temporarily, but long-term stability required legitimacy, and legitimacy required more than force. It required consent, ritual affirmation, and administrative consistency. And so, gradually, European polities evolved mechanisms that separated personal grievance from public justice. Royal courts expanded their authority. Written legal codes clarified procedure. Representative assemblies gained defined roles in taxation and consent. Even military campaigns increasingly required formal justification through diplomatic communication. These changes did not eliminate conflict, but they did reduce the unpredictability of retaliation. Where early medieval society had tolerated feud as a semi-legitimate form of dispute resolution, later medieval society increasingly confined violence within the boundaries of centralized authority. This was not a rejection of human impulse. It was a recognition of its danger when left unchecked. The most epic revenge stories of medieval history stand at the crossroads of this transition. They are dramatic because they reveal what happens when systems fail to contain personal grievance. They are consequential because they often accelerated institutional reform. The Wars of the Roses exposed the perils of ambiguous succession and factional dominance. The Anglo-French dynastic struggle demonstrated the strain of prolonged inherited rivalry. Byzantine palace coups revealed the fragility of authority tied too tightly to personal networks. In each case, retaliation illuminated weakness, and weakness demanded correction. By the dawn of the early modern period, Europe's political landscape had been reshaped by these centuries of tension. Monarchies were stronger, legal systems more centralized, diplomacy more regularized, warfare more professionalized. The world was not peaceful, but it was more structured. That structure was not designed in theory. It was forged in response to lived instability. And that is the enduring power of medieval revenge as a historical lens. It shows us governance in development. It shows us how fragile political systems respond under strain. It shows us that stability is rarely the product of idealism alone. It is the product of repeated confrontation with disorder. When we hear about epic revenge in medieval history, we might first imagine dramatic scenes, rival claimants, decisive battles, public punishments. But beneath those moments lies something more instructive. We see a civilization grappling with fundamental questions. Who has the right to rule? How should disputes be resolved? What limits must be placed on retaliation? How can authority survive challenge? The answers were not immediate. They emerged slowly, unevenly, often painfully. Yet through centuries of grievance and response, Europe moved from a world where personal feud could destabilize entire regions toward a world increasingly governed by centralized institutions. Revenge did not disappear. It became regulated. And in that regulation lies the true arc of medieval transformation. So as we step away from the castles and chronicles, what remains is not simply a collection of dramatic stories. What remains is a pattern, one that connects emotion to structure, grievance to reform, retaliation to institutional growth. The most epic revenge stories of medieval history are epic because they mark those moments of transformation. They remind us that power is fragile when legitimacy is unclear. They demonstrate that unchecked retaliation fractures societies. And they reveal how, through trial and consequence, political order matures. In understanding medieval revenge, we are not just looking backward at a turbulent age. We are tracing the slow construction of the political frameworks that would shape the modern world. And that long arc, from personal vendetta to institutional justice, may be the most enduring legacy of the medieval centuries. If we let the lens widen one final time, beyond individual rulers and rival dynasties, medieval revenge begins to look like something even larger, a mechanism through which societies negotiated power before modern political language existed. Today, we speak easily of constitutional authority, separation of powers, national sovereignty, and rule of law. In the medieval world, those ideas were embryonic at best. Authority was personal. Loyalty was relational. Obligation was sworn, not codified in the way we understand it now. When conflict arose, the tools available were shaped by that reality. Revenge filled the space where abstract institutions were still forming. When a ruler retaliated against a rebellious noble, it was not only punishment. It was clarification. It answered the question, who commands obedience here? When a rival claimant pressed his hereditary right, it was not merely ambition. It was an argument about lawful succession in a world where legal uniformity did not yet exist. These stories are epic because they were arguments made through action. And action had visible consequences. A confiscated estate redrew economic power. A deposed monarch shifted diplomatic alliances. A suppressed order reconfigured religious and financial networks. A civil war hardened regional identities. The medieval world did not have the luxury of quiet constitutional amendment. It negotiated legitimacy in the open, often under arms. But negotiation does not mean chaos. Even in the most dramatic revenge episodes, there were limits. Rulers needed allies. Nobles required legitimacy for their claims. Church authorities mediated and pronounced judgment. Public opinion, though not measured in modern ways, mattered profoundly in shaping loyalty. This interplay between force and perception shaped medieval political culture. Retaliation had to be seen as justified. Authority had to be seen as rightful. Punishment had to appear necessary. Over time, the emphasis on appearance matured into emphasis on process. Process became a stabilizing force. Trials, councils, charters, recorded decrees. These did not eliminate conflict, but they introduced predictability. They gave disputes a framework that extended beyond immediate emotional reaction. and predictability is the foundation of durable governance. One of the quiet lessons of medieval revenge is that unpredictability is destabilizing. When nobles cannot anticipate how disputes will be resolved, they prepare for conflict. When succession is unclear, factions form preemptively. When justice is inconsistent, resentment festers. Repeated cycles of retaliation made these risks visible. And so, gradually, European polities invested in structures that reduced uncertainty. The strengthening of hereditary principles in monarchies was not accidental. It was a response to costly disputes. The growth of representative assemblies was not purely philosophical. It emerged from practical necessity in taxation and consent. The consolidation of royal courts did not arise from abstract theory alone. It was reinforced by centuries of observing the cost of decentralized feud. Revenge, then, was both a symptom and a catalyst. It revealed structural weakness, and by revealing it, it demanded correction. The Middle Ages are sometimes characterized as a time of relentless instability. Yet this overlooks the continuity and learning that span the centuries. Institutions strengthened, administrative capacity expanded, political culture evolved. By the late medieval period, the foundations of early modern statehood were in place. Monarchs commanded broader loyalty. Bureaucracies administered law with increasing regularity. Diplomacy replaced some forms of open feud between kingdoms. And yet, beneath these structural developments, the human dimension remained constant. Ambition did not vanish. Pride did not vanish. Grievance did not vanish. What changed was how societies managed them. That management, imperfect, uneven, but real, is the deeper story behind the epic revenge narratives we remember. When we study the deposition of kings, the suppression of rivals, the civil wars sparked by inheritance disputes, we are not merely observing spectacle. We are watching societies test their own resilience. Sometimes they fractured. Sometimes they reformed. Often they did both. But in every case, the confrontation between grievance and authority forced evolution. For modern viewers, particularly in nations whose political systems descend from medieval precedents, these stories carry quiet relevance. They remind us that governance is never static. It is the product of accumulated experience, often hard-won experience. The rule of law did not appear fully formed. It emerged from centuries in which personal retaliation proved too costly to sustain indefinitely. The expectation of stable succession did not arise spontaneously. It developed in response to repeated wars of inheritance. The norm of institutional justice did not replace vendetta overnight. It gradually displaced it because centralized systems proved more reliable. And so, in the end, medieval revenge is not simply about settling scores. It is about transition. It is about a civilization moving from personal power toward institutional power. It is about the slow discipline of human impulse within structured governance. The most epic revenge stories of medieval history mark the points where that discipline was tested most severely. They are dramatic because they sit at moments of vulnerability. They are consequential because they pushed societies toward greater stability. And they endure because they reveal something fundamental. Power is never secure until it is supported by systems stronger than the individuals who wield it. In tracing these stories carefully, without exaggeration, we see not merely violence or rivalry, but growth. The medieval world wrestled openly with the problem of authority, and through cycles of grievance and response, it slowly built the foundations upon which later political order would stand.